Sharon Tate, the most brutal murder, what'd you think?
Well, I looked over in Vietnam and I said...
No, what'd you think about Sharon Tate and her unborn baby?
What did I think about it?
Yeah.
It's not my world. I don't live in that world.
Well, so you didn't care?
Care?
Suppose
What the hell does that mean, care?
Well, it means love. That means some sense
Put me in a solitary confinement, break my teeth out, break my ribs, bust me up, kick me down a hole,
right,
and then come back and tell me about care. I don't know what care is, man.
This is from the interview Manson did with Charlie Rose in February of 1986.
You say there was no family. There was no Manson family. There was a group of people that were having a good time. They say you told them. You told them to go murder. That's what they testify.
No.
You would go to your death saying, I had nothing to do with those murders and you put me here and I didn't deserve it.
I didn't say I didn't have anything to do with them. I didn't. You misunderstand.
Well, tell me what you're saying about it. If it's your last will and testament, what are you saying?
You got a circle, man, that man lives inside of. He lives inside this circle. He's responsible for this circle and this circle only.
Those people that died never violated your circle.
I didn't have anything to do with those people that died. I didn't have nothing to do with that. I never told nobody you go over and kill those people.
Manson went to the Sharon Tate house after the murders. That's what Manson officially claimed in the book Manson in His Own Words. In that book, Manson not only discusses in detail how he orchestrated the murders, but he also claims that he himself went into Sharon Tate's house after she was killed. Manson says he did this in order to see the crime scene himself before the police arrived. He wanted to make sure the killers didn't leave behind any evidence at the scene. I'll be reading to you exactly what Manson said in a few minutes. The killers that night at Sharon Tate's house were Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Tex Watson.
You said to Tex, you owe me one. Tex goes out and commits this atrocious, horrendous, horrible crime.
It's atrocious from where you're looking.
It's atrocious where anybody looks.
No. I look over at my lane, and I see those guys running through there, and I say, good job, man.
You didn't say that.
I would have if I'd have been the general in that. You better believe I would have said
You would have said, good for you for killing those people at my line?
Man, when you're in war, mister.
Okay, but what does war have to do with Sharon Tate's murder?
What's it got to do with any murder?
But then you said one more death. It doesn't matter.
Wait, they picked up they wanted to stop the war. You don't make no change without bloodshed.
No. You didn't feel any remorse?
The war Manson keeps referring to here is Helter Skelter. Charles Manson believed an apocalyptic race war between white and black people was inevitable. The name he came up with for this race war was Helter Skelter, a reference to the Beatles song of the same name. Long story short, Manson wanted this race war to happen. He believed if they could frame black nationalists for killing Sharon Tate and the others, it would spark retaliatory violence from the white population against black people. If you'd like to learn more about Helter Skelter, skip ahead to the last 25 minutes of this video. I do a deep dive. Now, how exactly would they frame the murders on black nationalists in the first place? Well, it all starts with this picture, which was taken a few weeks before Sharon Tate was murdered. The words political piggy and this panther paw were drawn with the blood of another Manson family victim. This blood graffiti was supposed to trick authorities into believing the Black Panther Party was responsible for the murder. Then, after Sharon Tate was murdered, her blood was used to write the word pig on one of her house doors in an attempt to link the Black Panthers to both crimes. Here's how this all started. This guy, Bobby Beausoleil, was a friend of Charles Manson's. He was not an official member of the Manson family, but he was closely involved with them. The Tate LaBianca murders took place on August 8th and 9th of '69. About 2 weeks earlier, on July 27th, there was another Manson-related murder. Bobby Beausoleil murdered Gary Hinman, a 34-year-old music teacher in Los Angeles. Essentially, the Manson family wanted money from Hinman. Hinman was held hostage at his house by the Manson family for a few days, until Manson himself slashed Gary across the face. Bobby Beausoleil subsequently stabbed Gary to death. Bobby then wrote the words political piggy on the wall with Hinman's blood. A few weeks later, Susan Atkins wrote the word pig with Sharon Tate's blood. The same thing was done the following night at the LaBianca murders. The words death to pigs was written on one of the walls of the LaBianca house, as well as various other messages. Political piggy, pig, and death to pigs. 3 different murder scenes, 3 similar messages. By having similar blood graffiti at all the victims' houses, it was an attempt to make it look like the Black Panthers were responsible, thereby serving 2 purposes. 1, making Bobby Beausoleil look innocent, and 2, igniting a race war. Unsurprisingly, neither happened. Bobby was never released from prison. As a matter of fact, he's still in jail to this day, and Manson's race war, Helter Skelter, never happened. Now, as mentioned, Manson claims he went to Sharon Tate's house after she was murdered. I'm going to read that to you now. Again, the killers that night were Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. And then there was also the getaway driver, Linda Kasabian. Now, in this retelling, Manson refers to them as kids. He was more than a decade older than all of them. At the time of the murders, Manson was 34, Tex was 23, Susan and Patricia were both 21, and Linda was 20. As per the Sharon Tate victims, Stephen Parent was 18. Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger were both 26. Jay Sebring was 35, and Wojtek Frykowski was 37. Manson also claims that when he went to the house after the killings, he brought along another person with him, though he doesn't name exactly who. Quote, "Approaching a house where you know there are dead bodies has a spine-chilling effect, and I think if I had been alone, I might have forgotten about going any further. My partner that night probably felt the same way, but neither of us spoke, and we did go on to see the whole gory mess. Tex and Susan's description had been accurate. What I was seeing was not a scene from a movie or some horrible acid fantasy, but real people who would never see the morning sun. I had thoughts of creating a scene more in keeping with a black against white retaliation, but in looking around, I lost the heart to carry out my plans. The 2 of us took towels and wiped every place a fingerprint could have been left. I then placed the towel I was using over the head of the man inside the room, Jay Sebring. My partner had an old pair of eyeglasses, which we often used as a magnifying glass or as a device to start a fire when matches weren't available. We carefully wiped those glasses free of prints and dropped them on the floor, so that when discovered, they would be a misleading clue for the police. Within an hour and 20 minutes of leaving Spawn Ranch, we were back. The sun was already bringing the light of day as I crawled into bed. I slept until well past noon, and by the time I woke up, the deaths had been discovered and were the major topic of all news broadcasts. Susan, Linda, and Patricia had been waiting for me to appear and immediately gave me a word-for-word update on what was being reported on the TV and radio. It was through these broadcasts that we first learned the names of the victims. Now, for his part, Tex slept through most of the day and wasn't around. But the girls, Susan, Linda, and Patricia, spent their day together, getting close to a TV or a radio when it was time for a newscast. They seemed to have taken on an air of superiority over the rest of the ranch. As for myself, I was surprised at how prestigious 3 of the victims were. Sharon Tate had been extremely popular in the celebrity world. Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, had been rich beyond the average person's dreams. And Jay Sebring had been a hairstylist of international fame. In learning of the popularity and wealth of the victims, I suddenly felt cheated that Tex, Susan, Linda, and Patricia had only come away from the Cielo house with less than $100 in cash. Later newscasts reported a variety of drugs were found at the scene by the police. I then felt added disappointment in myself and the kids for not searching the place for valuables and narcotics. Whatever else went on in my mind regarding the previous night, remorse or compassion did not affect me. I did, in days to come, laugh at the theories and speculations of police and reporters as they announced possible motives for the killings. But I was disappointed that no connection was made between the recent murders and Hinman's death. While rumors were still flying, I had visions of another night that would add to the confusion. A second night of killings. End quote. That book was released on January 1st of 1986. It's a compilation of interviews Manson did in jail with journalist Newell Emmons. After the book was released, Manson eventually retracted his claim that he snuck into Sharon Tate's house after the killings. However, given Manson was a complete hypocrite and a pathological liar, who knows if his retraction is true or whether he actually did sneak into the house.
Do you believe the Tate LaBianca murders had anything to do with sort of ending the period of the 60s, creating a
Yeah, it was the peak of the love that was running. Why don't we do it alone? No one will be watching us. And it's banging 24 hours a day. I didn't write that music.
Okay.
Take it to the Queen of England. Ask her why she's sending her kids over here ducking from that Hindu pimp that's coming out of that New Delhi penitentiary. See, there's a lot more in the world than you know about, see?
Boy, there's a lot that...
Sure there is.
What Manson was singing there was the Beatles song Why Don't We Do It in the Road from the White Album. Famously, Manson thought multiple songs from that album were encouraging him to commit violence, most famously the song Helter Skelter. Again, I'll be doing a deep dive into Helter Skelter during the last 25 minutes of this video. For now, I want to read to you more from the book Manson in his own words, where he describes when he stopped caring about human suffering, and how he blames a lot of that on his mother, who abandoned him as a child. Manson then describes in detail how the murders were committed at Sharon Tate's house on August 8th of '69. Quote, "On that evening of August 8th, 1969, I was aware of the fact that I was devoid of any caring emotion. Although there are numerous circumstances in my life which may have turned my head in the wrong direction, I can't put a finger on exactly when I became devoid of caring emotion. While I was waiting for the kids to return to Spawn Ranch, some of my thinking went back to the day in 1967 when I walked out of prison. At that time, I resented the law and the system, but I respected the people who abided by the laws and supported the system. During those first few months after my release, I knew that love and a sense of belonging was the greatest reward of my life. I remember this one time where I took a bunch of guns and threw them away because of the violence they represented. Yet here I was at Spawn Ranch waiting to hear about murder, not caring who had died or how many victims there were. And amongst all of this, the closest I could come to disliking myself was thinking, Charlie, you really are your mother's son. One dirty, bogus loser. Thinking of my mother quickly altered any softness that may have been entering my mind. I saw my mother guiding me through the courtroom door and speaking the words, "Yes, Your Honor, I want my son, but I can't afford to support both of us at this time." I remembered the argument my mother had with her boyfriend a few nights before that day in court. I remember hearing him say, "I can't stand that kid. Get rid of him, and then we can make it together as a couple." That's what I was thinking about the night of August 8th. I was also thinking about one of the institutions I was locked up in, and how 4 larger, older guys beat the crap out of me and wrestled me to the floor. And I remembered them taking turns raping me. I remembered one of the supervisors in charge of all the boys in the institution, a guy who was supposed to teach us the responsibility of being honest citizens. And yet, here he was, offering me up to get raped by his favorite delinquents. No, my head was straight now. Screw this world and everyone in it. End quote. Whether or not Manson was actually thinking of any of this stuff the night of the murders, he's clearly portraying himself as a victim here. Yes, you can acknowledge the horrific things Manson went through growing up, the abandonment, the sexual abuse, etc., without using that as some sort of twisted justification for the Sharon Tate murders. Now, at this point, Manson discusses being at Spawn Ranch the night of the Sharon Tate killings, eagerly waiting the return of his 4 family members. Tex, Susan, Patricia, and Linda. Of the 4, Linda was the only one who didn't actually kill someone. Her job predominantly that night was driving around the car, a yellow 1959 Ford Galaxy. Interestingly, in Quentin Tarantino's 2019 film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, an exact replica of this car is used in the film. However, the original car, the actual 1959 Ford Galaxy which the Manson family used, the present-day owner of that car offered it to Quentin Tarantino to be used in the film. Despite this, Tarantino chose instead to use a replica, not the original car. According to AutoEvolution.com, Tarantino and Stephen Butcher, the car coordinator for the movie, felt it would be too creepy and too unsettling to use the actual Manson car. Now, back to Manson. Quote, "That night at the ranch, I saw headlights approaching and recognized the old Ford before it pulled up in the driveway. I wasn't sure exactly what time it was, but it must have been around 2 in the morning on August 9th, and I was ready to hear the details of what had happened. Susan Atkins was the first one out of the car. She ran up to me, threw her arms around my neck, and said, 'Charlie, we did it.' After a moment, I pulled away from her and walked towards the car. Tex was getting out and favoring his leg. My first thought was he must have been wounded, but it turned out he had only bruised his foot while kicking one of the victims. He was glassy-eyed and grinning, and while he was not as high as Susan, he was not suffering from remorse. On the contrary, aside from his limp, he was moving around with an air of arrogance. We clasped our hands and exchanged a brotherly hug. I told him, "Don't go away, I want to hear about it." Meanwhile, Linda and Patricia were slowly getting out of the car. Both indicated they were not feeling too good. I told them to make sure the car was free of any possible evidence and then to go to bed. Susan, having noticed some blood on the exterior of the car, had already started to clean it. Once the car was fully cleaned, Tex, Susan, and I sat down in the bunkhouse of the ranch, where they gave me a complete rundown on everything that happened. Here's how they retold it to me. Tex had straight away driven to the house Terry Melcher had once lived in. He was familiar with the place, since Tex and I had both visited when Melcher lived there. It was a wealthy neighborhood, and the seclusion of the house was a major consideration. Once there, they drove towards the end of Cielo Drive. They parked the car facing downhill, ready for a quick escape. Before Patricia, Susan, or Linda got out of the car, Tex first climbed up a telephone pole nearby and cut the lines leading into the house. Then, the four of them climbed over the front fence onto the front yard. However, as they walked up the driveway, a vehicle started coming towards them. Tex, Linda, Susan, and Patricia immediately dropped to the ground, and the driver didn't see them. The car came to a halt near the front gate so the driver could open it. When the car stopped, Tex approached the driver, a teenage boy named Stephen Parent. He shot Stephen several times, killing him. Tex, Linda, Susan, and Patricia then pushed the car off the driveway. They waited there until they were sure that no one had been alerted by the shots. Then, they made their way towards the house, a ranch-style dwelling with a large lawn and a swimming pool. The girls stood at a rear door, while Tex cut through a screen and entered the home through a window. Opening the door, he asked Susan and Patricia to come with him, telling Linda to remain outside to warn them if she saw or heard anyone approaching. As they quietly entered the living room, they saw the first of four individuals who were in the house. A man, Wojtek Frykowski, had fallen asleep on the couch with the lights on. Motioning for the girls to circle from behind the couch, Tex approached the sleeping man directly and stuck a gun in his face, saying, "Wake up." Wojtek opened his eyes and saw the barrel of a pistol less than 6 inches away. Startled, he tried to get up, but Tex put the gun against his forehead and told him to stay where he was. Susan described that first encounter. "Oh, Charlie, you should have seen it. Here's Tex standing over the man with a gun in one hand and a knife in the other. And Tex also had the coil of a rope over his shoulder. He reminded me of a Mexican bandolero. And when that man on the couch asked Tex what he was doing there, who he was, and what he wanted, Tex told him, 'I'm the devil, and I want your money.'" End quote. The actual quote Tex Watson famously said, according to the official court documents, was, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business," not "I'm the devil, and I want your money," as Manson recalled in this book. It's not clear if Manson deliberately changed that line for some reason, or if he just forgot what Watson said. Or, alternatively, maybe that really is what Watson said. "I'm the devil, and I want your money." I don't believe that's actually what Watson said, but as you'll hear in a few minutes, Manson says he regretted that they didn't steal more money from Sharon Tate's house after the murders. He says his followers only took about $100, which they should have taken more. That's basically the only regret he has from that whole night, none for the actual killings themselves. Quote, "Now, as Susan and Tex both continued to explain to me what happened that night, at this point, after startling Wojtek, Tex told Susan to look for something they could tie Wojtek up with. Tex could have used the rope he had to tie up Wojtek, but he wanted to save the rope for something else. And so, Susan returned with a towel, which she and Patricia used to tie Wojtek's hands from behind. Then, Susan went through the house looking for other occupants. Going down a hall, she passed an open bedroom door. Inside the room, laying on a bed reading a book, was a young lady, Abigail Folger. It was like the lady almost expected me to be there, Susan described. She glanced at me and said, 'Hi.' So I waved back and said hi. Then, I went past her room until I came to another door. Looking in, I saw a pregnant lady lying on her bed, Sharon Tate. She was beautiful, Charlie. You'd have loved her. A guy, Jay Sebring, was sitting on the edge of her bed, holding her hand and talking to her. Neither one even looked up. Anyways, I went back to Tex and told him about those 3 people. Tex then told Susan to bring them into the living room. With just a knife, she was able to intimidate Abigail, Sharon, and Jay into the living room. Once they were in the room, Tex started giving orders and demanding money. That rope he had with him, well, now it was put into use. He gave it to Susan and Patricia and told them to tie it around the prisoners' necks. The untied man, Jay Sebring, made a lunge at Tex, and Tex shot him. He fell to the ground wounded, looking up at Tex with an expression of disbelief and fear. Tex subsequently kicked Jay in the face, which injured his own foot in the process. Until this point, things had been going smoothly for the invaders, but with the shot and the first injury, fear and hysteria prompted the victims to struggle for their lives. But those kids had come to kill, and they were bent on doing so in a shocking, sensational manner. The desperate struggles of their victims only intensified their acts of violence. Sebring still lay on the floor. Sharon and Abigail screamed but fell silent after being threatened with knives by the girls. A rope was then placed around the necks of Sharon, Abigail, and Jay Sebring. The prisoners wanted to know the intentions of the invaders, and Tex informed them that they had to die. Hysterically, the women pleaded for their lives. Ignoring the women, Susan went over to add more ties to the already tied-up Frykowski. As she began to do so, Tex said, "Kill him." Susan raised her arm to plunge with her knife, but Frykowski managed to free his hands and grab Susan by the hair. They struggled with each other. Susan continued to stab away while Frykowski pulled her hair and tried to stop her, finally causing her to drop the knife somewhere near the couch. Severely wounded, Frykowski broke loose and headed towards the yard. Tex chased after him, leaving Patricia alone to hold the rope attached to Jay Sebring, Sharon Tate, and Abigail Folger. Frykowski, now in the yard, struggled and fought desperately as Tex administered the final knife wounds. However, Tex's final thrusts were suddenly interrupted by a frantic shout from Patricia. While Tex and Susan had been focusing their attention on Frykowski, Abigail Folger had freed herself from the noose and was making an effort to escape. Patricia caught her, but was losing the battle until Tex got back. He clubbed Folger with the pistol and stabbed her until he thought she was dead. Between his dash from Frykowski to Abigail, Tex noticed Jay moving. He paused long enough before catching up with Abigail to stab Jay Sebring several times. Once Abigail Folger was down and apparently dead, Tex returned to finish the job on Frykowski. Sharon Tate, meanwhile, frozen in fear, had not made an attempt to flee until now. At this point, Susan, Patricia, and Tex were outside, and so Sharon made a run for it in the opposite direction. Patricia saw Sharon trying to escape and alerted Susan. The two of them were easily able to catch Sharon and bring her back into the living room. Sharon, still unharmed, now had the attention of all three killers. Ignoring her pleas for life and the life of her unborn child, Susan held Sharon while Tex stabbed. But at some point, Susan must have borrowed someone's knife because she said she also stabbed Sharon. Using Sharon's blood, Susan wrote the word "pig" on one of the doors. They abandoned the idea of stringing the victims and hanging them up, explaining, "Everything was too messy and we were too tired." Linda Kasabian had left the property and had the motor running by the time the others reached the car. On the way back to the ranch, they discarded their clothing and weapons at various points along the way. Now, a normal person would find the details of the night's events as shocking and horrifying. But I had long ago stopped measuring myself by society's standards. The story I was hearing from Tex and Susan did not shock me. I did not feel pity or compassion for the victims. My only concern was whether it resembled the Hinman killing. Would the police now have reason to believe that Bobby was not the slayer of Hinman? And were the kids, loaded with drugs, clever enough to avoid leaving prints or evidence of their identities? Knowing Susan and Tex and their flair for dramatic exaggeration, I actually doubted that the killings went down the way they described. And another thing, did they leave a trail which could lead anyone back to Spawn Ranch? Concern for clues compelled me to get in the Ford and head to Bel Air. I took another member of our circle with me. Now, returning to the scene of any crime is risky business. We went past Cielo Drive and looked around to make sure there was no police. Everything was quiet. It seemed, in fact, there were no cops around yet. Still, not wanting to be too obvious, we parked the car a short distance away from the house and then walked towards it. We entered the grounds by climbing over the fence as the kids had done. As Susan and Tex had said, the first victim's car was off the driveway, a short distance from the gate. Going by Tex's description of how he had approached the car and how he had pushed it, I carefully wiped the car clean of any possible fingerprints without disturbing the body of the dead boy inside. End quote. Next, this was the part where Manson discussed what it was like walking into Sharon Tate's house, the segment I read earlier in this video. Now, as Manson mentioned, one of the reasons he feels he has a lack of empathy, a lack of any sort of caring emotion for other people's suffering, is his mother. He blames his broken relationship with his mother as one of the main reasons he has this lack of normal human caring. I want to take a look now at that relationship between Manson and his mom. How as a child he was repeatedly abandoned by his mom and left to survive on his own. Manson talks about his father, or lack thereof, his uncles and other members of his family. He discusses the abuse he took from other kids growing up, how his mother constantly had different lovers, and how one of his mother's partners ultimately led to Manson ending up in an extremely abusive juvenile school where he was repeatedly abused sexually for 3 years. Now, as horrific of an upbringing as Manson had, it still doesn't justify the eventual murders he orchestrated and committed. I just want to be very clear about that. So with that said, the following is what Manson said about his mom. This is from Manson in his own words. Quote, "My mother's name was Kathleen Maddox. She was born in Ashland, Kentucky on January 11, 1918. She was the youngest of 3 children from the marriage of her parents, Nancy and Charles Maddox. My mother's parents loved her and meant well by her, but they were fanatical in their religious beliefs, especially Kathleen's mother, aka my grandma. According to my fundamentalist grandmother, displaying even an ankle or just an overly friendly smile to someone of the opposite sex was sinful. Drinking and smoking was forbidden. Makeup was evil and only used by women of the streets. Even just cursing would put you in hell as quickly as stealing or committing adultery. My grandfather worked for the railroad. He worked long hours, a dedicated slave to the company and his bosses. He, like my grandma, was a fundamentalist evangelical. He wasn't, however, the disciplinarian grandma was, but, like his children, he was under his wife's thumb. If he tried to comfort mom with a display of affection, such as a pat on the knee or an arm around her shoulder, grandma was quick to insinuate he was being vulgar. To keep harmony between them, grandpa let his wife rule their home. Poor man. In later years, he was taken away from the home he supported and died in an asylum. For mom, life was filled with a never-ending list of denials. From awakening in the morning until going to bed at night, it was, "No, Kathleen, that dress is too short. Braid your hair. Don't comb it like a hussy. Come home straight after school. Don't let me catch you talking to any boys. No, you can't go to the school dance," etc., etc. In 1933, at the age of 15, my mother ran away from home. Or rather, was driven away, might have been a better description. Some writers have portrayed my mother as a teenage whore. Because she happened to be the mother of Charles Manson, she's automatically downgraded. I prefer to think of her as a flower child of the 30s, 30 years ahead of the times. Her reasons for leaving home were no different than those of the kids I became involved with in the 60s. And like those kids, she chose to be homeless on the streets instead of listening to the one-sided demands of her parents. As for mom being a whore, those early teachings at home prevented her from selling her body. She did have the vanity of a whore, though. And while she was never a raging beauty, she was a pretty girl. Her red hair and fair complexion made her noticed in most any surrounding. She was barely 5 feet in height and would consider herself fat if she got over 100 pounds. Yet, despite her vanity, physical attractiveness, and display of confidence, my mother was searching for her own identity and for acceptance by others. In search for her acceptance, she may have fallen in love too easily and too often. But to call her a whore at that time? No. In later years, because of hard knocks and tough times, she may have sold her body some. I am not going to knock her. On the contrary, I wish my mother had been smart enough to start out as a prostitute. You can sit back and say, a statement like that is about what is expected out of Manson's mouth. But to me, a whore is about as honest of a person as there is on this earth. She has a commodity that is hers alone. She asks a price for it, and if it's agreeable, the customer is happy, and the girl has her money for groceries and rent. So yes, an honest prostitute does more than help herself. She is good for the community. End quote. I'm going to share with you much more of what Manson said about his mom in just a moment, but just to soak in what he said right now, that is an insane thing to say about your own mom, that her being a prostitute is good for the community. As you can probably tell, Manson had a very messed up relationship with his mother and a very messed up childhood in general. Here's more from Manson. Quote, on November 12, 1934, while living in Cincinnati, Ohio, unwed and only 16, my mother gave birth to an unplanned child. Hospital records list this kid as quote-unquote no-name Maddox. That child, me, Charles Miles Manson, was an outlaw from birth. The guy who planted the seed was a young drugstore cowboy who called himself Colonel Scott. He didn't even stick around long enough to watch my mother's belly rise. Some father. I saw the man once or twice, so I'm told, but I don't remember his face. The name Manson came from William Manson, who was not my father. He was a fellow Mom lived with shortly after my birth. He was considerably older than my mom, and because of his persistence, they eventually got married. I don't know if that was his way of trying to lock Mom down, or if it was a moral thing because there was a kid in the home. Either way, it was through him that I got the name Manson. But a father? No. The marriage wasn't one of those long-term things, and I don't remember him. Whether the divorce was his fault or Mom's, I never did know. But probably Mom's fault. She was always a promiscuous girl. When Mom ran away from her parents, a home that had completely dominated her, she exploded into a newfound freedom. She drank a lot, she slept around, answered to no one, and did what she wanted. So when I was born, she hadn't experienced enough of life or that newfound freedom to take on the responsibilities of being a mother. My mom was not ready to make the sacrifices required to raise a child. With or without me, Mom still had some living to do. And so I'd often be left with a relative or a hired sitter, and if things got good for my mom, wherever she was, she wouldn't return to pick me up. Oftentimes, my grandparents or other family members would have to rescue the sitter until Mom showed up. Naturally, I don't remember a lot of these things, but you know how it is, even in a family. If there is something disagreeable about someone, it always gets told. One of my mother's relatives delighted in telling me the story of how my mother once sold me for a pitcher of beer. My mom was in a cafe one afternoon with me on her lap. The waitress, a would-be mother without a child of her own, jokingly told my mother that she would buy me from her. My mom replied, "A pitcher of beer and he's yours." The waitress set up the beer, Mom stuck around long enough to finish it off, and left the place without me. Several days later, my uncle had to search the town for the waitress and then take me home. Now, in saying these things about my mother, you may think that I'm selling her short. By society standards, her measurements certainly are not up to par. But hey, I liked my mom. I loved her. She was perfect. In doing nothing for me, she made me do things for myself. When I was about 6 years old, my mom dropped me off by my grandparents for what was supposed to be just a day or two. Several days later, I remember my grandfather asking me to go for a walk with him. Once outside the house, he became soft-spoken and kinder than I ever remembered him. As we walked, we played games and ran races, and he would let me outrun him. He put me up on his shoulders and carried me while I pretended I was a giant and taller than anyone else alive. After a while, we sat down to rest. He put his arms around me, and fighting back tears, he told me, "Your mother won't be coming back for a long time." I don't know if the hump came in my throat because my grandfather began to cry, or if it was because I realized what he was telling me. My mother and her brother Luther had attempted to rob a service station in Charleston, West Virginia. The story goes that they had used a Coke bottle as a weapon to knock the attendant unconscious. They were caught and sentenced to 5 years in the Moundsville State Prison, almost 3 hours north of Charleston. At Moundsville, she lived in the women's ward of the prison, but her work assignment was near death row. It was her job to clean an area that included the scaffold, where people would be hung to death. Mom told me a story that one day, as she worked, she saw the guards escorting a man to the scaffold. Normally on a hanging day, no one but the officials and the person to be executed are supposed to be in the area. But by accident or oversight, they forgot to inform my mother that a hanging was taking place that day. Afraid she would get in trouble for being there, my mother hid in a broom closet near the scaffold, near the execution site. When the trap sprung and the guy fell down with the rope around his neck, the velocity and the guy's weight caused the rope to sever his head. As Mom peeked out the door for a first-hand view of the hanging, the head rolled right to her hiding place. She swears that the eyes on the head were still wide open, that death was literally staring at her right in the face. 27 years later, when I was first placed on death row in San Quentin, California, I looked at the gas chamber. The room's 2 viewing windows looked like 2 huge eyes of death. Instantly, my mind flashed to my mother, and I had a vision of her looking into the eyes of death herself. During that moment, I understood more about my mother than at any other point in my life. Now, while Mom was doing time at Moundsville, it kind of fell on my grandmother to take care of me, whether she wanted to or not. So, there I was in the same household that my mother had run away from 6 years earlier. Strict discipline. After a few weeks at Grandma's, it was decided that I would live with my mom's sister, Joanne, and her husband, Bill, in McMetchen, West Virginia. My Uncle Bill had opinions about how young boys were supposed to act, and being a sissy and afraid of everyone in the neighborhood wasn't his ideal of a male youth. I remember him telling me to stop crying at everything and start acting like a man, or he was going to start dressing me and treating me like a little girl. Well, I guess my behavior really didn't improve that much. Right now, I can't remember what particular thing made him do it, but on my first day in school, Bill dressed me in girls' clothing. I was embarrassed and ashamed. The other kids teased me so much, I went into a rage and started fighting everyone. Turning the other cheek, as Grandma had always wanted me to do, was forgotten. I took my lumps and shed a little blood, but in that school, I became the fightingest little kid they ever saw. It must have pleased Uncle Bill, because from that point forward, I only wore boys' clothing. Joanne and Bill were good people and tried to do right by me. In their home, I lived what you might call a normal life, but it's hard to describe where my head was emotionally, with Mom in jail and me living with a couple I didn't belong to. Heck, I don't even know what kind of thoughts were going through my head at that point. Their treatment of me was fine. I got my butt kicked when I deserved it, and my rewards when I did something right. I was trained in proper manners and taught to wash my face, comb my hair, and brush my teeth like any other kid. But at the end of the day, I didn't belong. I can still hear other grown-ups in that community insulting me. And the kids I played with telling me, "Your mother's no good. She's a jailbird." Haha. Well, one year shortly after Christmas, I got even with some of those kids who were laughing at me. I had spent Christmas with my grandparents. My only present for that year was a hairbrush, a Superman hairbrush. As I opened the present, my grandmother said to me, "If you brush your hair with it, you'll be able to fly like Superman." Young fool that I was, I carried that brush around with me for days and was constantly brushing my hair. I'd jump off the porches, anything with a little elevation, and really expected to soar in the air like Superman. Well, I never did fly. And to this day, that was the only lie my grandmother ever told me. The kids in the neighborhood rub things in even more now by showing me all their presents. They had toys of all kinds, wagons, trains, and cowboy hats. Even now, I'm not sure if I just resented being laughed at or if I was jealous of what they had and I didn't. But in any case, one day I rounded up all their toys I could find and carted them home with me. I stacked up some wood and threw the toys on top of it and started a fire. The kids were mad. Some cried, others threatened me, and their parents called the sheriff. Although I wasn't taken to jail, it was my first encounter with the police. I was 7 years old. Mom was released from Moundsville prison when I was about 8. The day she came home is still one of the happiest days of my life. I think she missed me as much as I missed her. For the next few days, we were inseparable. I was her son, and she was my mom, and we were both proud of each other. I loved it. I guess my mom did too, but a 23-year-old girl needs more than an 8-year-old son to complete her world. If Mom had some catching up to do in her life before she went to prison, now she was really behind. It's a lifetime too late to think about, but things might have been a lot different if Mom had gone her way and left me with the aunt and uncle. But she didn't, and I was glad. It was some trip living with Mom. We moved around a lot, and I missed a lot of school and blew a lot of what my aunt and uncle had been trying to teach me. Mom and I definitely did not live a routine life, yet I dug every minute of it. I only wished I knew if the next day was going to find me with her or pawned off on someone else. If I couldn't be with Mom in the city, my next favorite place was at Uncle Jess's in Moorhead, Kentucky. My stays with Uncle Jess would vary. Sometimes I'd just be there for a week or two. Other times I might stay for a couple of months or more. Uncle Jess lived in a log cabin elevated several feet off the ground by poles. He was a hillbilly at heart, with a beard, bare feet, bib overalls, moonshine, and hound dogs. In his eyes, family could do no wrong, and Jess would protect them no matter what. But if one of the family gave him any backtalk, they'd be in trouble, because he was the king. He had 4 daughters, all of them pretty. I saw Jess bring out his shotgun more than once to send guys running away from the house. The girls might sneak around, but when Jess was there to say something, they jumped. I found out why they were so willing to mind when one day I pushed one of Jess's dogs off the porch. "Son," he told me, "that hound wasn't bothering you. You got no right pushing it around. Don't mistreat no animals." Then, with that said, Jess proceeded to give me a beating I've never forgotten. He wasn't much of a talker, but when he spoke, people paid attention. He sometimes warned people, "Don't take them kids off the land." He was right, for almost everyone who left the land lived to regret it or died because of it. Uncle Jess himself died on his land rather than let someone take him away from it. At the end of his life, for whatever reason, the law came down on Jess. But instead of giving himself up, he blew up the cabin and himself. Now, to return to the story of my mother, before being sentenced to Moundsville, Mom had become a pretty streetwise girl, but she really learned all the ropes during her time. She even added a new dimension to her sex life. I didn't learn about it till years later, but while she was at Moundsville, some of the older women showed her that sexual pleasure didn't only happen between men and women. My mom was pretty discreet when it came to making it with another woman. Dummy that I was at that age, I didn't mind sleeping in the other room if she had a female friend spending a few days with us. With her gameness and prison calculation, she had all the answers and could hustle with the best of them. Trouble was, she was a fiery little broad who liked her booze and wouldn't take any crap from anyone. Consequently, we might have to leave a place in a hurry. I remember one night Mom came running into our little old one-room apartment and jerked me out of bed saying, "Come on, Charlie, get up. Help me get our things packed. We gotta get out of here." She had been working as a cocktail waitress at the Blue Moon Cafe in McMention. One guy wouldn't keep his hands off her, and Mom told him to cool it a couple of times. When he didn't, she grabbed a fifth of booze and busted the bottle over his head. He was still on the floor when she left. "Hurry up, Charlie. I just flattened one of them Zambini brothers, and I ain't waiting to see if he's dead or alive. Either way, I'm in trouble." The Zambini brothers were two of the town hoods, and everyone was afraid of them, including my mom. We moved around some, but that is about the fastest we'd ever left the place. The next couple of years saw us in Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, and probably a couple of more states, and who knows how many cities. By the time I was 12, I'd missed a lot of school, seen a few juvenile homes, and no longer believed all my mom's lovers were quote-unquote uncles. In general, I was cramping my mom's style. Some of these uncles liked me, some of them didn't. But the feeling was more than mutual. I didn't like any of them. I guess my jealousy and resentment of those uncles sleeping with my mom was pretty close to the surface, and it began causing trouble between us. End quote. I just want to reflect on what Manson said there before I continue what he was talking about. He said that he had a jealousy towards these people that were sleeping with his mom. Now, at first glance, that could be taken as maybe an Oedipal thing where he actually had affection for his mother and wanted to sleep with her. But I don't think that's what he meant. I think he just meant maybe in a motherly way he just wanted to be close with her, and he resented that these other men were close with her instead. I've never heard of Manson talk about his mother like this before, so it'd be interesting if more information about his view of his mother in this regard would surface one day. Anyways, back to what Manson was saying. Quote, "When I was 12, my mother's current lover brought things to a head. Unlike Mom's usual 2 or 3 day romances, this guy had been around for a few weeks. One night, I was awakened by the sound of their drunken voices arguing. The words I remembered the most were his. 'I'm telling you, I'm moving on. You and I could make it just fine, but I can't stand that sneaky kid of yours.' And then Mom's voice. 'Don't leave, be patient, I love you and we'll work something out.' My poor mother. We'd long ago worn out our welcome with the relatives and friends who were willing to keep me for any length of time. I'd become spoiled and was accustomed to doing pretty much anything I pleased. I'd been tried in a couple of foster homes, but I just wasn't the image those parents felt like being responsible for. A few days after I'd overheard my mother's argument, my mom and I were standing in front of a judge. My mother, in one of her finer performances, was pleading hardship. She told the judge what a struggle life was and that she was unable to afford a proper home for me. The judge said, "Until there is a capable earning power by the mother and a decent stable home for Charles to return to, I am making Charles a ward of the court and placing him in a boys' home." At that moment, the words didn't mean anything to me. I was angry at Mom and didn't want to live with her and her friend. I was angry. I wasn't depressed or disturbed. The shock was still a day away. The court placed me in a religious-oriented school, the Gabolt Home for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. I felt all right while being registered in the school office, but when all the papers were completed, things started going wacky in my head and stomach. By the time I was escorted to the dormitory I would live in for the next 10 months, I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. Tears ran down my cheeks. My legs were so rubbery I could hardly walk. Some invisible force was crushing my chest and stealing my life away from me. I loved my mother. I wanted her. Why, Mom? Why is it this way? Come and get me. Just let me live with you. I won't be in your way, Mom. I was lonely. Lonelier than I'd ever been in my life. I had never felt that lonely since. I wasn't angry at her anymore. I just wanted to be with her, live with her under any conditions. I didn't want to be in some school locked away from everything. After the initial shock, the following days weren't too bad. The people who ran the school were good enough to me, but they were stern in their discipline. The answer to any infraction of the rules was a leather strap or wood paddle and lost privileges. Since I had a problem with wetting the bed, it seemed like I was getting more than my share of whippings for something I had no control over. At 12, I was the youngest boy there. But being under 5 feet tall and weighing less than 65 pounds, I was also one of the smallest. I was easy pickings for those who were inclined to be bullies. Gabolt was not considered a reform school, but it operated in a similar manner. And while the other kids with me in the school were not necessarily juvenile delinquents, they had the same resentments towards society that juvenile delinquents do. Resentments against their parents, the law, and confinement. It never happened to me there at Gabolt, but I saw kids forced into homosexual acts. I was told about all kinds of ways to beat the law, and I learned how to keep my feelings to myself. Because if you care too much about a part of your life or personal habits, others will take advantage of it and ridicule you. Gabolt taught me that friends can be cruel and enemies dangerous. My mom would come to see me sometimes, but not all that often. If she said she'd see me next week, I'd be lucky if she showed up the next couple of months. When she did come, she'd tell me, "It won't be long before I have a steady job and a nice place to live. Then I'll come and get you and take you home with me." We'd talk about how nice it was going to be when we were back together. I was starting to grow and was definitely older in mind. I felt I could be a big help to my mom if she would take me home with her. It all sounded great and I was eager to start living the life we talked about. She'd leave and I'd run back to my friends, telling them, "Pretty soon I'll be going home. My mom said so." Then, the next visit would be the same. "Pretty soon, Charlie," were my mother's next words. I waited and waited. It didn't happen. Sick of Gabolt and sick of waiting, I ran away. Naturally, I went straight to my mom's. I thought I could show how grown up I was and how I could help her. There was no guilt trip in my mind about running away. I was sure my mom would throw her arms around me, as glad to see me as I was to be there with her. She'd take me down to the judge and tell him she was in a position to take care of us. Everything would be all right. Man, was I dreaming. She turned me in, and the next day I was back at the boys' home. But I didn't feel like a boy any longer. There were no tears, at least none that ran down my cheeks. I didn't feel weak or sick, but I also knew I could no longer smile or be happy. I was bitter, and I knew real hate. The trip back to the boys' home was a waste of gas and time. I split the very first chance I got. Goodbye, Gabolt. Goodbye, Mom. I had learned my lesson, thanks to the memory of my own mother rejecting me and turning me in. My philosophy was now trust no one and depend on no one. As for a place to run to, I felt my chances of staying lost and out of sight of the police would be better in a big city rather than a small town. Indianapolis was my choice. Terre Haute and the Gabolt School for Boys are about 160 miles from Indianapolis. Once safely away from the school, I knew better than to try reaching my destination by way of the roads or highways. Thus, I trudged through fields and over hills, staying out of sight. I walked the railroad tracks for a bit and hopped on a freight train for a short way. I slept in the woods and under bridges. I met bums, weirdos, and hobos who shared their meals with me. Most people place all those derelicts in the same category, but I found there is a definite distinction between them. A bum is a guy who is down and out, maybe one who is too lazy to work and survives by begging. A weirdo has become so hooked on his booze that he is a social outcast. He cares for nothing but the booze and how to acquire it. A hobo is on the road because that is his chosen lifestyle. Some are honest and survive by their wits, also doing a little work here and there. Others are into doing anything that will provide for the day's needs. Stealing and lying are as natural to them as breathing. I lived and ate with these guys until reaching Indianapolis, and through them, I learned an awful lot about survival without the luxuries of a house and modern conveniences. When I got to Indy, I slept in the alleys and old sheds until the night I got a bonus while burglarizing a grocery store for something to eat. The cash register change for the next morning was in a cigar box under the counter. When I opened the box and saw the money, I thought I was rich and didn't even bother to cart out any of the stuff I was stealing. The cash was a little over $100, more money than I'd ever had in my hands before. I rented a room in Skid Row, bought me some clothes, ate as much as I liked, and spent the money like there was no tomorrow. A few days later, I was broke and hungry. I started making my way on the streets any way I could. I'd sweep storefronts, wash windows, clean garbage cans, anything that might earn me a few cents. I'd also steal whatever I could get my hands on and sell the goods to anybody for any kind of price. I doubt if I averaged a penny on the dollar for the value of what I sold, but for a snot-nosed kid like me, I was feeling pretty chesty and thought I was getting up in the world. I was getting by without starving, had my own room, and was my own boss. I had accumulated a wealth of experience, and I thought I really knew what the world was all about, but my run away from Gabalt only lasted a few weeks. I had stolen a bike for the joy of having one, as well as for the transportation. It was that bike that got me caught. When the police arrested me, the juvenile authorities couldn't believe that a 12-year-old kid could be living by himself. It took them a few days to discover that I was a runaway from a home for boys. Once they knew that, they located my mom. She appeared in juvenile court with me, but she was still unable to tell the judge that she could take me back to a good home. The judge was a sympathetic guy who really didn't want to send me to a reform school. He arranged for Father Flanagan's Boys Town to accept me, a renowned nonprofit organization founded by a Catholic priest in 1917 near Omaha, Nebraska, dedicated to rescuing and caring for at-risk children. Well, I didn't stick around much. No fault of the schools, I just wasn't into the discipline, and running away had become as much a part of my nature as stealing. 4 days after being checked in at Boys Town, me and another guy split. We stole a car, wrecked it, pulled a couple of armed robberies, and finally made it back to Indianapolis. At Indy, we went to my new partner's uncle's house. The uncle was a World War II vet who was living on disability. He was also a thief, and his nephew and I fit right into his program. He was as glad we showed up as we were to have a place to stay. In no time at all, he had lined up places for us to burglarize. It was kind of a one-way street since my partner and I did all the dirty work, but the uncle took the big end of the money. We got caught going through the skylight of the third place his uncle sent us to. When the cops arrested us, they took me to the Indianapolis City Juvenile Home. I spent a day and a part of a night there. As fate would have it, the same day I was put in juvie hall, a maintenance man was doing some work around the place. He turned his back on his toolbox and I stole a pair of wire cutters. That night, after we were counted and the lights were out, I got busy with the wire cutters. In about 20 minutes' time, some 30 to 35 juvenile delinquents were loose on the streets of Indianapolis. Some of the guys may have stayed on the loose for a lengthy period of time, but for me, it was a wasted effort. I was picked up less than 2 hours later driving a stolen car. I hardly knew how to shift it and could barely see over the dashboard. I was back in custody by the time the morning paper hit the newsstands with a front page spread, complete with photo, that wrote me up as the quote-unquote ringleader. Instead of keeping me in juvie hall, they booked me in the county jail. The youngest offender ever, they told me. That was in 1948. I was 13 years old, and almost a year had passed since the day I entered the Gabalt School for Boys, the beginning of my life in institutions. I had been a frightened little boy when I went there, and I had resented it with an indescribable passion. But I have to admit that the administration at the Gabalt School had the boys' interest and future as their top priority. That is more than I can say for the place I spent the next 3 years of my life. The escapes from Gabalt and Boys Town and my escapades on the run left the judge very little to do but sentenced me to a bona fide reform school, the Indiana School for Boys, located in Plainsfield, Indiana. And let me say, Plainsfield was a real beauty. It has to have changed since I was there. Too many human rights groups and concerned citizens have appeared for a place like that to continue to operate in the manner it did. I know the school is still in operation, but I hope all the warped, sadistic people I met there are now gone. While most who get sentenced to those places do need to be separated from the honest element of society, Plainsfield has created more hardcore criminals than honest citizens. That's because of the type of person who seeks employment in prisons. For every person whose heart is in the right place, for every person who is dedicated to constructive rehabilitation, there are 10 status-seeking jerks out to prove something to themselves. Some are frustrated policemen who couldn't qualify for the police force. Others are without the ambition or skills to maintain a job in a competitive trade. And, believe it or not, many of them are there to obtain an outlet for their own perversion. Confinement and punishment are necessary in the present society. But having sadistic, perverted jerks working in an institution that is supposed to rehabilitate people is the biggest bunch of crap going on. You can't expect to straighten out an offender's life when the people in charge of him have worse hang-ups than he does. At Plainfield, I was in trouble from the very beginning. The probation officer who took me in there left me standing in the hallway while he went to the administrator's office to sign me in. I had already noticed there were no fences, so while waiting, I checked the front door. It wasn't locked. I was gone. My escape attempt, however, lasted only about 15 minutes. I didn't even get off the ground. 30 minutes after arriving at Plainsfield, I had been registered, assigned to a housing unit and a work detail, and charged with an escape attempt. Cottage 11 was my home. That evening, like every evening and morning, the whole institution assembled for a count, as they do in the military. When the count was completed and cleared, a supervisor, A.B. Clark was his name, shouted out that Cottage 11 was to report to the plumbing shop. As we marched, I was thinking that we were all just going to do some extra work. We got there, halted, and stood like soldiers on parade. Then Clark called out, "Charles Manson and his 4 best friends step forward." Heck, I didn't know what was happening, but I stepped forward as commanded. Naturally, quote-unquote 4 best friends didn't step forward, because I didn't have any. I'd only been there for 3 hours. When no one else moved forward, old Clark picked out 4 other boys from the cottage and then motioned us inside the plumbing shop. Tension was beginning to mount, and I started to realize that I was in for something other than just extra work. Once inside, Clark grabbed me by the shoulder and shoved me towards the center of the room, saying, "Okay, Manson, drop your pants." I asked, "What for?" Clark shouted, "Just get those pants down." The shop had regular workbenches around the walls, but in the middle of the room was a bench that was especially designed for what was to come next. It was about waist high on the average man. With my butt exposed, I was told to lay across the bench. I hesitated. Then Clark kicked me in my butt and told the boys to anchor me down. I was now in proper position for one of 2 things, getting raped or a beating. End quote. Just a heads up for those of you who may be uncomfortable with the topic, in the next several minutes, Manson goes into detail about various episodes of abuse he went through, often sexual. Quote, "When Clark picked up a leather strap to whip me, I remember feeling relieved. At least I wasn't going to get raped." Clark wasn't too tall, about 5'7", but he was very strong. The strap was made of leather, with a strong wooden handle. He hit the bench next to my head a couple of times to loosen himself up. I just about pissed myself out of fear. "Stretch him out," Clark said, and they all tightened their grip. I found out later that if any of them let go during the lashing, they themselves would get beat the same way. Clark knew how to use that strap. I wanted to shout the first time he laid it across me, but gritted my teeth and waited for the next blow. After 3 more swats, the detail boy holding my right arm whispered, "Groan or cry, don't be tough with this guy. He don't stop until you cry." Clark hit me twice more on the side, and whether I wanted to or not, I screamed and the tears came rolling down. He backed off and I was relieved because I thought he was through. But no luck, he was just changing sides. I got an equal number of lashings on my other butt cheek. When Clark was finished and the boys let go of my arms and legs, I didn't have enough strength to lift myself off the bench. I just slid to the floor and lay there like a quivering puppy. When I was finally able to stand, I noticed that none of the detail boys would look at me. But Clark had a grin on his face, and with the strap still in hand, he said, "Manson, we've been told you're a rotten kid, and you're going to be full of scars before you leave this place." Well, it's true. I still have those scars. Anyways, I pulled my pants back on, and the blood was surfacing from where the strap had broken the skin. I was sobbing for breath, trying to get enough air in my lungs to control my body and to erase the fear and pain. Back outside, I got in line as a unit and we marched back to the cottage. The others went into the cafeteria hall, but I was too sick to even think about eating, and I wanted to see a doctor. But after that beating, or as they called it here, a fanning, you weren't allowed any medical attention. Not until the next day. Welcome to the Indiana School for Boys. The next morning, I went to the infirmary where they put some ointment on my wounds. Then I went to work. I was assigned to work with the cows. A guy named Mr. Fields was in charge of the boys working on that dairy detail. Mr. Fields was aware of my beating, my fanning, and so, nice guy that he assigned me a wheelbarrow and a shovel. My job was to take all the manure in the wheelbarrow, push it up a steel ramp, and dump it in a bin. With the strain of shoveling the manure and the exertion needed to push the loaded wheelbarrow up the ramp, the cuts on my butt started opening up and pus and blood came out. Mr. Fields was so sympathetic that he cracked me across the butt with a stick he always carried and encouraged some of the inmates to take shots at me as I struggled up the ramp. About a week later, 4 of the bigger and older inmates cornered me in one of the feed bins. Right away, I knew what they were up to. I made a dash for the door, but 2 of the guys grabbed me and the other 2 stripped my pants off. I felt like a wild man struggling frantically. I screamed and hollered, but they gagged me so that my screams were muffled. 2 of the guys held me down while one of them tried to rape me. The 4th guy was standing by the door, making sure no one was looking. I managed to break loose, but all 4 of them wrestled me to the floor and beat me some more. 2 of them had time to rape me before the guy at the door shouted, "The man is coming." They tried to get away from the scene before Mr. Fields arrived, but they didn't quite make it. I was crying and trying to get my pants back on, but all Mr. Fields said was, "You know, I don't allow any wrestling. You guys should get the hell out of here. And you, Manson, go wash your face and stop all your cryings." After that, Mr. Fields himself started playing games with me like I was some joint punk available to anyone. On numerous occasions, depending on my mood, he would tell me, "Pull your pants down, Manson. I want to see if you've been getting raped." The first time I thought he was just kidding, and I walked right on by him. But he grabbed me and yanked my pants down around my ankles and made me bend over while he inspected me. He always did this in the presence of several other inmates. To add insult, he would pick up a handful of raw silage from the dairy floor, spit tobacco juice on it, and shove it in my butt. I got him lubed, he'd tell his pets. So rape him if you get the chance. The tobacco juice and silage burned and I got an infection from it, but the humiliation was worse. Yeah, Fields was a real beauty. He really knew how to care for the wards of the state and even earn his state paycheck. I worked in this dairy cow detail for 5 months and every day was some kind of unimaginable experience. I was never able to even things up with Mr. Fields, but I did take some of that desire out on the first guy who had raped me. That was about the only thing I ever got away with at Plainfield. One night, after the lights were off and everyone was asleep, I took one of the iron handles used for cranking the windows open. It was about 12 inches long and weighed 2 to 3 pounds. It wasn't as large or heavy as I would have liked, but it did the job. I crept over to where the rapist was, eased his blanket up over his head, and clubbed him several times as hard as I could. I left him there unconscious, and on the way back to my bed, I slipped the crank under the covers of one of the other guys who had been involved with the rape. The beaten inmate might have died, but he was lucky. Security came through the cottage for a late-night count a few minutes later. In routinely lifting the blanket to make sure there was someone under the covers, the security man saw the blood and realized he was unconscious. He was taken to the hospital and treated for a severe concussion. Shaking down the cottage for the weapon, the guards found it in the other guy's bed. All of us were questioned, but no one was charged with the assault, although the other rapist was the prime suspect. When his partner returned from the hospital, the 2 of them didn't have much to do with each other. It was whispered that I had done the clubbing, and no matter how small I was, no one else at Plainfield ever tried to put his stuff inside of me again. I ran away from the boys' school constantly, but not because I was a rebel, but rather because it was always me who was being punished when someone had to be punished to illustrate a point. I didn't have anyone on the outside to tell my troubles to. No one was visiting me, and I got very little mail. I was just there, and nobody cared. The fear of being caught wasn't any worse than the fear of what the next breath might bring. so my head was looking toward the road at every minute. One of my escapes was planned so skillfully that I was sure I'd make it. About 6 guys would be assigned to the early wake-up crew at 4:30 in the morning. Their job would be to round up the cows, bring them to the barn, and feed them during milking time. The way each day's early morning crew would be identified would be with bed tags. There would be about 6 boys each night with a bed tag. The night attendant would then go up to these beds with the tag and wake up the boys for their 4:30 a.m. shift. These 6 workers would be trusted to work without supervision until Mr. Fields arrived at 6 a.m. In other words, there was about an hour and a half without any supervision. And so, one night, I stole the tag from a crew member's bed and put it on my own bed. The night attendant woke me up and I went out with the others. One of the other guys on the crew was a friend of mine, and so the 2 of us went to the far pasture to get the cows there. Except I kept going past the pasture, and my friend took the cows to cover for me. I wasn't missed until after Mr. Fields showed up. I got off the institution grounds fast enough, but I wasted a lot of time sneaking around town trying to find a car I could steal. Unable to find one, I decided to move on my feet and stay off the roads until I made it to the next town. Plainsfield is a small town bordered by a river on one side. Thinking I might be seen if I used the bridge, I decided to swim the river. When I was about halfway across, I could see people on the bank. I turned around and started swimming the other way, only to see more people on the other bank. They were guards and inmates from the school. My heart sunk. I didn't know what to do. It seemed senseless at that point, but I turned downstream and tried to outswim all the people on the riverbank. Finally, a couple of them dove in the river and dragged me ashore. Grinning with his tobacco-stained teeth, Mr. Fields was there to pull me up the bank. Back at the school, a guard gave me 30 lashes with the escape strap. The escape strap was longer and thinner than the strap used by Clark. It cut a lot more and brought blood instantly. The lashing put me in bed for several days, and it was a couple of weeks before I could walk without wanting to lie down and cry. That escape attempt got me out of the dairy cottage and away from Mr. Fields, but it wasn't much better. I was now put in a cottage that was run by Mr. Carr. Carr was an ex-Marine, a big guy whose favorite thing to do was a quote-unquote jawline. He had a couple of different versions of his famous jawline. One was to make 2 lines out of all the inmates in the cottage. The lines were about 4 feet apart, a good punching distance. The sucker who was being punished ran between the lines while the others swung at him with close fists. If one of the blows knocked him off his feet, he had to get up and try to go through again. If Mr. Carr thought someone wasn't putting enough force into their punches, that guy would have to run the line. Carr's other version of the jawline held more personal satisfaction for him. He'd place you about 20 or 25 feet from him, then he'd double up his fist, hold his arm at your jaw level, and say, "Run." You then had to charge into that fist. If he felt you hadn't charged at full speed, he would make you do it again and again until he was satisfied. If the blows were severe enough to require medical attention, a broken nose, cut lip, or damaged eye, he would give you a pass to the infirmary listing the cause of injury as slipped in the shower or fell while horseplaying. Mr. Carr was another guy like Mr. Fields. He would turn his back while some of his preferred inmates would try to rape others. I was at the Indiana School for Boys for over 3 years, and the only good thing I can say about it is that it had an impressive front lawn. From town, it looked like a small university. But while proud parents bragged of their child's good behavior and scholastic accomplishments, I was busy watching my back and taking the crap those guards dished out. At an age when most kids are going to nice schools, living with their parents, and learning all about the better things of life, I was cleaning tobacco juice out of my butt, recuperating from the wounds of a leather strap, and learning to hate the world and everyone in it. When I was 16, I finally made a successful escape with 2 other inmates. The day we left, I had no more promise of going home through proper channels than I had 3 years earlier on the day I arrived. Release was obtained through merit or a court order. My mother never sought a court order, and my escape attempts and other infractions put me on the minus side of the merit system. When my escape partners and I got away from the institution, we stole a car and headed towards California. Along the way, we stole other vehicles and abandoned them as we needed. For gas and food money, we burglarized grocery stores and service stations. We made it as far as Utah, where we were arrested for being in a stolen vehicle. Since the stolen car had been driven across different state lines, we were turned over to the federal authorities. In March of 1951, I was sentenced to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. I'd had 2 weeks of freedom. I knew these new federal offenses meant a lot more time in jail, but I didn't care. I was free from the Indiana School for Boys. The difference between a federal reformatory and a state reformatory is night and day. On a federal level, there seems to be more concern about how you got there and what it will take to straighten your life out. At the state level, at least during my confinement in Indiana, the idea was to punish the crap out of you and make you feel sorry for ever being born." End quote. I'll be sharing with you more from Manson's youth in later videos. Manson, of course, spent most of his life in prison, not just his youth. I want to share with you now another quote from Manson where he talks about his prison life after the Tate LaBianca murders. Charles Manson was set on fire in a prison attack which left him with severe burns all over his body. He describes it all in detail in this interview from 1986, which I'll be sharing with you. Manson discusses how he feels his life is in constant danger, and that he feels like a zoo animal in prison. In other words, Manson takes absolutely no responsibility for his actions or why he's in prison, and instead portrays himself as the victim of media misrepresentation, that he's actually no different from you or me. The following is from Manson in his own words, quote, "Jails, courtrooms, and prisons have been my life since I was 12 years old. By the time I was 16, I had lost all fear of anything the administration of the prison system could dish out. But convicts being unpredictable made it a real possibility that dying in prison would be my fate, especially when the prosecuting attorney, the media, and some Department of Correction officials planted seeds in the minds of other convicts by statements such as, due to the nature of Manson's crimes, he will be a marked man for other convicts seeking attention and notoriety. In hearing Judge Older pronounce my death sentence on April 19, 1971, I realized he was doing so with the full authority of the California judicial system. Yet, I knew I would never be executed by the state of California. Die in prison? Perhaps, but executed by the state? No. And I was right. Within a year being placed on death row, the existing capital punishment law was abolished in the state of California. All those awaiting execution were automatically given life sentences instead. For most of those on death row, it was a new lease on life. But for me, no particular elation. Just the thought of, now what will I have to contend with? My paranoia has been well-founded, for due to the nature of the crimes, the amount of publicity about my arrest, and the lengthy court proceedings, the name of Charles Manson has become the most hated and feared epithet in the current generation. It's something I've had to bear since my arrest in 1969. Because of the heavy security and my isolation from the general convict population, the time spent on death row was the most comfortable and relaxed I have spent in the last 17 years. But since then, I've been a special case in the California penal system. And because of that, I've spent my ordinary confinement dodging spears, knives, and death threats from other convicts, as well as having to watch every guard who gets near me. The latest, most newsworthy threat to my life happened in the arts and crafts room at the California Medical Facility. I was sitting on a stool working on a clay sculpture. It was one of my first efforts at any form of sculpting. So engrossed that it was one of the few times ever since being locked up that I let my guard down. I didn't hear the footsteps, nor was I conscious of anyone being around me until a cold liquid was poured over my head, soaking my hair, face, and most of my clothing. Startled, I leaped to my feet and faced the direction from which the liquid came. My eyes were already burning from the substance, a highly inflammable paint thinner, so it was already with blurred vision that I saw the assailant, a long-haired, bearded guy, who then threw a burning match at my face. My hands weren't quick enough to prevent the flame from making contact with the thinner, and like a bomb exploding, I was instantly a human torch. With my hair, face, and clothing on fire, I lunged towards my assailant, but he eluded me. The pain of the fire and the instinct for self-preservation didn't allow me to continue pursuing him. Instead, I hit the floor and pulled my burning jacket over my head in an effort to smother the ignited paint thinner. Though there was a guard and several inmates in the room, I had long ago learned not to expect help or sympathy from anyone. Not that I was even thinking about what others might be doing, for at that moment my head was buzzing with what to do to extinguish the flames. I realized how vulnerable I was if the assailant came back to attack me again, but first things first, I had to get the fire out. Fortunately, that guy didn't come at me a second time, but just stood back and watched me struggle. I was aflame for 45 seconds to a minute, long enough to have all the hair burn from my head and face. My scalp, face, neck, left shoulder, arm, and hand suffered third-degree burns. I spent a few days in the hospital, a couple of them on the critical list. The attack, ironically, had nothing to do with who I am or what I am accused of. It was the result of a discussion on religion that took place the day before I became a Human Torch. The guy who threw the match is as flaky and disoriented about the laws of society as most people believe I am. Yet he, like myself, doesn't see himself as some freak with a demented personality, but rather as a person who was dealt a hand that couldn't be played by the rules and values of your society. My name is Charles Mills Manson. As of this writing, I am 51 years old. If I stretch to my fullest height and cheat a little by slightly lifting my heels from the floor, I can achieve a height of 5'5". I think at one time I weighed a healthy 140 pounds, but a time or two during my confinement, I have dropped as low as 115. A bulky, bruising hulk I am not, but my voice can be as big and loud as the largest of men. In 1970, prior to and during the court proceedings that resulted in my conviction, I had made more magazine covers and news headlines than Coca-Cola has advertisements. Most of the stories and articles written painted me as having fangs and horns from birth. They say my mother was a skank, my nose was snotty from birth, and my diapers, when I had any on, were full of crap, which was often seen running down my dirty legs. They would have one believe that before I was 5, I was a beggar on the streets, scrounging for food to feed my dirty face and fill my empty stomach. They'd have you believe that by the time I was 7, my first followers were already stealing and bringing me the spoils. That before I turned 9, I had a gun in my hand and was robbing the old and feeble. That by 13, I had a police record that would qualify me to be on Nixon's staff or the head of the mafia. Isn't that the way you have framed me in your thoughts? Haven't the famed prosecuting attorney, the judges, my alleged followers, and the news media given you that picture of me? Would it change things to say I had no choice in selecting my mother? Or that being an unplanned child made me an outlaw from birth? That during those so-called formative years I was not in control of my life? Hey, listen, by the time I was old enough to think or remember, I had been shoved around and left with people who were strangers, even to those I knew. Rejection, more than love and acceptance, has been a part of my life since birth. Can you relate to that? I doubt it. And this late in life, I couldn't care less. But I've been asked where my philosophy, bitterness, and antisocial behavior came from. So, without searching to change public opinion, I'll share some of my life as I've lived and remembered it. You've read everyone else's Charlie's this, Manson's that, and their version of the family's history. Books have been written. More are being written. Movies made, and undoubtedly more movies in the making. The media have had a puppet to dangle and a dummy in which to plunge their swords. All of them have taken my words and thoughts, rephrased them, and published them with twisted meaning. Distortion, sensationalism, and fabricated quotes were printed daily, so much so that life on Earth no longer held any valid meaning for me, nor does it now. My body remains trapped and imprisoned by a society that creates people like me, but my mind has entered a chamber of thought that is not of this earth. I have learned that to be oneself, one must never utter a word, make a sound or motion, or even bat an eye. For by doing so in the presence of another, an opinion will be formed. A self-styled psychologist will analyze you and describe you to others so that you become something other than what you are. As I said, the media have had their day. Nobodies have become rich and influential. So-called Manson family members have purged and turned, testifying for the state, lying in the courts. They have written books and sold interviews, playing down their role, putting it all on Charlie. Lawyers on both sides of the fence have made fortunes through their association with the Manson family trials. My feeling is I've been raped and ravaged by society, screwed by attorney and friends, sucked dry by the courts, beaten by the guards, and exhibited by the prisons. Yet my words have never been printed or presented as they were said. So at this point, I have nothing to gain or lose by telling it the way I feel it was. To date, 37 of my 51 years of life have been spent in reformatories, foster homes, or prisons. For the past 17 years, I have been living like a caged animal in a zoo. The cage is very much the same, concrete and steel. I am fed just as the animals are, through the bars and on schedule. I have guards patrolling my cage, making certain it is still locked and that I still live. People come to visit the institution, and no matter what their other interests, all want to know, where is Charles Manson kept? Can we go by his cell? And like good zoo attendants, the guards accommodate. Seeing Charles Manson in his cage, like seeing the rarest of wild animals, has made their visit complete. To satisfy my personal curiosity, I look into a mirror to see if perhaps horns are growing from my head or fangs protruding from my mouth. Unless the mirror lies, I see no horns or fangs. I check the rest of my body to see how it differs from those who stop and stare at me. With eyes that see, blink, and stare, like those who have just stopped to view me, I see a body, 2 arms, hands and feet, and a head that grows hair in the customary places, complete with eyes, nose, ears, and a mouth. I'm no different from those who stop by to give me their hated glare, or from you who are interested in what I have to say. If writers and other media people had stuck to the facts as disclosed by investigating law officers from the beginning, Charles Manson would not have been remembered. But with each writer, each book, or each television personality exaggerating, fabricating, and reaching for sensationalism, adding hostilities of their own, myself and those who live with me became more than what we actually ever were. Most of the stories depicted me and those arrested with me as dope-crazed sickies. A June 1970 issue of Rolling Stone had an article titled "A Special Report. Charles Manson, the incredible story of the most dangerous man alive." However, there were publications that speculated that the crimes weren't without underlying principles. For example, a February 1970 issue of Tuesday's Child, a short-lived newspaper from Los Angeles, said that I might be more of a revolutionary martyr than a callous killer. And so naturally, I and some who shared in the madness were quick to pick up on anything that was even remotely sympathetic. With that said, I didn't read either of those articles at the time. But since late 1969, I have been reading similar headlines and seeing pictures of myself almost daily. All of them refer to me as the hippie cult leader who programmed people to kill for him, the man responsible for the Tate LaBianca slayings. They established me as some kind of a mythical super being that could look into the eyes of another person and make him or her carry out my every whim. I was portrayed as a Pied Piper who lured kids into crime and violence. Knowing what I am, how I was raised, and all that I've ever been, I see those stories as ridiculous. I am dismayed at the readers who lap up the lies and believe in them, but I have to hand it to the guys who created the image. The skillful writers who can suck the most out of anything and build mountains from molehills. I really shouldn't blame the readers because I kind of get caught up in the stories myself. But when I start believing I might really possess all the powers attributed to me and I try to work a whammy on my prison guard, he or she shuts the prison door on my face. Back to reality. I realize I am only what I've always been, a half-worth nothing. The reason for all that I'm sharing is not to fight the case of the most dangerous man alive, if I am that or was, but just to give the other side of an individual that has been compared with the devil, and even the devil had a beginning.
End quote. I'll be sharing more of that interview from Charles Manson in future videos. Manson was a manipulator and not just in interviews. He would often manipulate his followers, for instance, with drugs. The following is from Manson killer Susan Atkins on getting brainwashed with LSD.
I used to think that you came down off an acid trip after 12 hours. That's not true. When you take acid, you think you're coming back to where you started from. Originally, you don't. And every time you drop acid, you get a little bit further away from reality. And I took so much acid that I just was what I would term spaced. Your concepts of right and wrong. So you step out beyond those bounds, and when you step out beyond those bounds, the imagination begins to take over. And the imagination can be a very deceitful thing. I would take a thesis, writing a book on what LSD can do to the mind.
LSD was a very important factor in the CIA's MKUltra mind control program. LSD was also a very important factor in Charles Manson's cult, his quote-unquote family. In a previous video I made about Manson and LSD, I explored how Manson used the drug to brainwash his followers. This was such a prominent subject when it came to Manson that it was argued the Manson killers shouldn't get the death penalty because they'd been brainwashed with LSD. Because of the brainwashing, they weren't really in control of their actions, and therefore they shouldn't get the death penalty. This was an actual argument being made in court. That's just a glimpse of how controversial of a subject LSD was when it came to Manson. Of course, Charles Manson and his killers were all sentenced to death. However, their death sentences were changed to life imprisonment when, in 1972, the California Supreme Court found the death penalty to be unconstitutional. For those of you who haven't seen that video I made on LSD and the Manson trials, I will be going over that information in the second half of this video. But first, I want to take a look at MKUltra. MKUltra was an extremely controversial top-secret CIA program which operated from 1953 to 1973. The program violated all sorts of human rights. The objective of MKUltra was to develop mind control techniques to be able to get people to do things without them even realizing what they were doing. The ultimate goal of MKUltra was to be able to take normal, ordinary people and turn them into remorseless killers. The parallel between how MKUltra wanted to achieve this and how Manson did achieve this, how Manson was able to take seemingly normal people and turn them into complete psycho murderers, is very, very stark. Many people believe Manson was part of MKUltra. In search of mind control techniques, MKUltra experimented on people with drugs, specifically LSD. LSD was central to how Manson was able to brainwash his followers. There's a lot of parallels. I am currently in the process of making a longer video which really dives deep into the different ways it appears that Manson was connected to the CIA, including the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, Dr. Jolly West, and more. For this video here, however, I want to take a look at what MKUltra was as a whole. What exactly was MKUltra? Who in the CIA approved of this program? How many people died from these experiments, and what exactly were these experiments? This is the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. In the 1970s, in order to prevent information about MKUltra leaking to the public, the CIA decided to destroy all documents related to the program. However, what the CIA overlooked was that there were thousands of documents related to MKUltra that weren't located at the headquarters. They forgot to destroy those documents. It's a very interesting, controversial history. The following is from Chaos by Tom O'Neill, where he goes over all of this extremely controversial subject matter. Quote, "The CIA, then in its infancy, saw mind control as a natural extension of communism. In 1949, the CIA launched Operation Bluebird, a mind control program that trampled on human rights. The CIA tested drugs on American citizens, most in federal penitentiaries or on military bases, who didn't even know about, let alone consent, to the battery of procedures they underwent. Regardless, in 1952, the CIA found further quote-unquote justification to keep these abuses going. That year, 1952, in Korea, captured American pilots admitted on national radio that they'd sprayed the Korean countryside with illegal biological weapons. It was a confession so beyond the pale that the CIA blamed communists. The POWs must have been brainwashed. That word, brainwashed, didn't appear in English before 1950. It articulated a set of fears that had coalesced in post-war America. Soviets were trying to force an evil philosophy onto the world. Technology had destabilized every atom of human nature, and a new class of chemicals with unpronounceable names could reduce people to machines. Thus, the human mind, like any other appliance, could be rewired and automated. Once the Korean War was over in 1953 and the American POWs returned, the Army brought in a team of scientists to quote-unquote deprogram them. Among those scientists was a young psychiatrist from Cornell, Dr. Lewis J. West. He would later claim to have studied 83 prisoners of war, 56 of whom had been forced to make false confessions. West interviewed them at length, undoing the treacheries of the quote-unquote thought reform they'd undergone in enemy hands. Dr. West and his colleagues were credited with reintegrating the POWs into Western society, and maybe more importantly, getting them to renounce their claims about having used biological weapons. Dr. West's success with the POWs gained him entry to the upper echelons of the intelligence community. As the Cold War bred paranoia, the CIA accelerated its mind control efforts, and West, I learned, carved out a niche he'd occupy for decades to come.
Initially, the CIA wanted only to prevent further brainwashing by the Soviets, but the extraordinary power of psychotropic drugs, particularly LSD, was hard to ignore. Thus, a defensive program became an offensive one. Operation Bluebird morphed into Operation Artichoke, a search for an all-purpose truth serum. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a poisons expert who headed the chemical division of the CIA's technical services staff, had convinced the agency's director, Allen Dulles, that mind control ops were the future. Gottlieb, whose aptitude and amorality had earned him the nickname the Black Sorcerer, developed gadgetry straight out of a sci-fi. High-potency stink bombs, exploding seashells, poisoned cigars, poisoned anything. Dulles, convinced that the American dream was at stake, ensured that Gottlieb was well-funded. On April 13, 1953, Dulles officially set Project MK-Ultra into motion. MK-Ultra's broadest goal was to influence human behavior. Under its umbrella were 149 sub-projects, many involving research that used unwitting participants. Having persuaded an Indianapolis pharmaceutical company to replicate the Swiss formula for LSD, the CIA now had a limitless domestic supply of its favorite new drug. The CIA hoped to produce couriers who could embed hidden messages in their brains, to implant false memories and remove true ones in people without their awareness, to convert groups to opposing ideologies, and more. The loftiest objective was the creation of hypno-programmed assassins. Interestingly, LSD, the same substance that held the promise of controlling minds and quashing communism, was used in CIA office pranks. Agents would quietly slip LSD into their colleagues' drinks to achieve much-needed first-hand knowledge. A plan to spike the punch bowl at the CIA Christmas party was quashed when higher-ups reminded the office that it could cause insanity. Now, the most sensitive work for the MKUltra program was conducted far from CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It was farmed out to scientists at colleges, hospitals, prisons, and military bases all over the US and Canada. The CIA gave these scientists aliases, funneled money to them, and instructed them on how to conceal their research from prying eyes, including those of their unknowing subjects. Feeling that it was their patriotic duty, the scientists accepted their secret missions in defiance of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. In 1949, at the Nuremberg trials that adjudicated the crimes of World War II, the United States adopted the International Code for Human Experimentation, which stated, "A person must give full and informed consent before being used as a subject." MKUltra scientists trampled that code constantly and remorselessly, in ways that stupefy the imagination. Their work encompassed everything from electronic brain stimulation to sensory deprivation to quote-unquote induced pain and psychosis. They sought ways to cause heart attacks, severe twitching, and intense cluster headaches. If drugs didn't do the trick, then they tried to master ESP, ultrasonic vibrations, and radiation poisoning. One project tried to harness the power of magnetic fields. Operated on a strict need-to-know basis, MKUltra was so highly classified that when John McCone succeeded Dulles as the CIA director in late 1961, he was not informed of its existence. Fewer than half a dozen agency brass were aware of MKUltra at any period during its 20-year history. When Gottlieb retired in 1972 or 73, the project retired with him. By then, it had been pared down to almost nothing, as the agency focused on other ways to halt communism and sway policy making abroad and at home. Still, when the Watergate scandal and the CIA's involvement in it consumed the nation in the early 70s, it occurred to the CIA leadership that it would be prudent to cover their tracks. Director Richard Helms ordered Gottlieb to destroy all MKUltra files. In January of 1973, the technical services staff shredded countless documents describing the use of hallucinogens, including every known copy of a manual called LSD, Some Unpsychedelic Implications. MKUltra evaporated. In their haste to purge their misdeeds, the agents forgot about a stash of some 16,000 additional papers in an offsite warehouse. Even internally, those files would remain undiscovered for several years, but it was only a matter of time until the story broke. MKUltra became fodder for rumors around Washington. In December of 1974, the project finally came to light in a terrific flash of headlines and intrigue. Seymour Hersh reported it on the front page of the New York Times. Huge CIA operation reported in U.S. against anti-war forces.
3 government investigations followed, all hobbled by the CIA's destruction of its files. When the records were available, they were redacted. When witnesses were summoned, they were forgetful. In 1975, the Church Commission was formed. The Church Commission was a U.S. Senate Select Committee that investigated abuses by the CIA, FBI, NSA, and IRS. The Church Committee's final report unveiled a 1957 internal evaluation of MKUltra by the CIA's Inspector General. Precautions must be taken, the document warned, to conceal these activities from the American public in general. The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions. Later on, a 1963 review from the Inspector General put it even more gravely. A final phase of the testing of MKUltra products places the rights and interests of U.S. citizens in jeopardy. In fact, as the Church Committee's report went on, MKUltra had caused the deaths of at least 2 American citizens. One was a psychiatric patient who'd been injected with a synthetic psychedelic. The other was Frank Olson, a CIA-contracted scientist who'd been unwittingly dosed with LSD at a small agency gathering in the backwoods of Maryland, presided by Gottlieb himself. Olson fell into an irreparable depression afterward. This depression led him to hurl himself out of the window of a New York City hotel. Olson had been brought to this hotel by other agents for quote-unquote treatment. A continued investigation by Olson's son Eric strongly suggests that the CIA arranged for agents to fake his suicide. They threw him out the window themselves out of fear that he would blow the whistle on MKUltra and the military's use of biological weapons in the Korean War. The news of Olson's death shocked a nation already reeling from Watergate, a nation already less inclined than ever to trust its institutions. The government tried to quell the controversy by passing new regulations on human experimentation, but scrutiny and internal pressure on the CIA continued to mount. The pressure got to a point where the CIA was forced to make an admission. It hadn't destroyed everything. It had come to their attention that thousands of pages about MKUltra were collecting dust in the off-site warehouse. And so came another congressional investigation more robust than the last, with 16,000 additional pages of documentation at its disposal. Senators Ted Kennedy and Daniel Inouye subpoenaed a number of CIA spooks. Among them was Gottlieb, rousted from his retirement in California and forced to defend his actions before the Senate. Or, rather, before some of the Senate. Gottlieb claimed that his heart condition precluded the possibility of his addressing the whole chamber. Instead, he was installed in a smaller room, where he answered questions from a select group while the masses listened over a public address system. As the New York Times pointed out, Gottlieb managed to elude the lights and microphones and the crush of reporters waiting for him in the Senate hearing room. He was spared the sight of the incredulity that spread over their faces as he admitted that he had destroyed MKUltra's files not to cover up quote-unquote illegal activity, but quote-unquote because this material was sensitive and capable of being misunderstood. Gottlieb resented the harm done to his reputation, and he was loath to provide specifics about MKUltra experiments, saying that he'd never witnessed any himself. Gottlieb's destruction of the MKUltra files was a federal crime. It was investigated by the Justice Department in 1976, but according to the Times, quietly dropped. His brutal courses of experimentation broke any number of laws, but he was never prosecuted. He testified before the Senate only under the condition that he'd receive total criminal immunity. As for those 16,000 new pages, they were mainly financial records, but a few more tantalizing documents found the CIA explicating its ambitions. Can we obtain control of the future activities, physical and mental, of any individual, willing or unwilling, with a guarantee of amnesia? They asked. Can we force an individual to act against his own moral concepts? And can an individual be made to perform an act of attempted assassination? Senate investigators condemned MKUltra unanimously. Kennedy branded it perverse and corrupt, an erosion of the freedom of individuals and institutions, in the name of national security. Inouye called it grandiose and sinister. The CIA's new director, Stansfield Turner, swore that he'd sent all existing MKUltra files to the Justice Department, which would mount a thorough investigation. But still, between the destruction of records and the subpoenaed agents' sudden memory lapses, everyone knew that the full facts may never come out. The Senate demanded the formation of a federal program to locate the victims of MKUltra experiments and to pursue criminal charges against the perpetrators. That program never coalesced. Surviving records named 80 institutions, including 44 universities and colleges, and 185 researchers, among them Louis J. West. The New York Times identified him in a front-page lead story no less as one of 7 suspected scientists who'd secretly participated in MKUltra under academic cover. And yet, not one researcher was ever federally investigated, and only 2 victims were ever notified. The Times had called MKUltra a secret 25-year, $25 million effort by the CIA to learn how to control the human mind. But it looked like no one would suffer any consequences for it. Griffin Bell, the Attorney General at the time of the revelations, told me the files never arrived at the Justice Department, despite Stanfield Turner's sworn claim to the contrary. Bell said they must have just fallen through the cracks. As for Turner himself, he told me he could no longer remember having testified that the CIA sent the files. "I'm just drawing a total blank here," he said. I read his remarks back to him. "I guess I did testify about this," he replied. "Somebody fed me the stuff and I played it back." In any case, the New York Times ran 27 stories on MKUltra, 8 on the front page. But no one in the press corps and none of the senators involved followed up to see that the promised investigations took place. Since then, the program's bewildering significance has been engulfed many times over by other controversies. Receding in the rearview mirror, MKUltra looks like just another example of the CIA's megalomania at the zenith of the Cold War. End quote. As mentioned, I am making a longer video about Charles Manson and MKUltra. In the meantime, let's go over some more information about Manson, LSD, and the Manson trials. The following is Manson killer Leslie Van Houten on LSD.
When I first met him, he was kind of upset that I was there because I had been with a friend of his and he was frightened that my being or staying at the ranch would come between him and this other fellow. But on the whole, he was a very dominant person. Sometimes he was nice and sometimes he wasn't. More than anything else, though, he was the only one that any of us ever felt knew that he knew what he was doing. And when we would take the acid, we would take it with a lot of us together, and then he would speak to us and move with his gestures, and more or less, he never told us, you know, that was one of his things. He always made sure to never tell us anything. He would suggest things.
Manson always made sure to never tell us anything. He would suggest things. That is exactly how LSD and mind control work. LSD is a powerful hallucinogenic drug. It has been proven that when someone is under the influence of LSD, aka acid, it's possible to permanently influence someone's thought patterns by suggesting things to them. The following is from drug researcher Charles Fisher regarding how someone under the influence of LSD can be manipulated, brainwashed into committing violence. Quote, "You can tell somebody to hurt somebody, but you can call it something else. Hammer the nail into the wood. The wood, perhaps, is a human being. It could result in some violent activity, even though LSD was considered a love drug." End quote. Charles Manson's control over his followers was largely based on this model. He would frequently give his followers LSD. Then, while his followers were under the influence, Manson would repeatedly suggest things to them over and over and over again. This method of brainwashing people by LSD and repeated suggestions was studied by the CIA. In other words, Manson's LSD brainwashing techniques were the same as the CIA's. Momentarily, I'm going to read to you a quote from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, where he examines the Manson trials of the early 70s and how prevalent the subject of LSD was during those trials. As a matter of fact, it was even suggested during the trials that the Manson girls shouldn't get the death sentence because they were brainwashed. If you haven't yet read his book Chaos, I highly recommend picking up a copy. Quote, "After 7 grueling months, the first phase of the trial drew to a close, and the jury, after 10 days of deliberation, arrived at unanimous guilty verdicts. Now, in the second phase, the prosecution had to present an argument for putting the defendants to death.
The prosecution's case and the defense's counterarguments led to some of the most unnerving testimony yet, including a kind of symposium on LSD, not as a recreational drug, but as an agent of mind control. This death penalty phase of the trial entertained some of the same questions that engrossed and vexed me for the next 2 decades as I wrote this book. Had Charles Manson really brainwashed people? And if so, how? And if one person was truly under the psychological control of another, then who was responsible for that person's actions? For the first time, the 3 convicted women, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, took the witness stand. One by one, they explained their roles in the murders, absolving Manson of any complicity and proclaiming their utter lack of remorse. The families of the victims looked on in stunned silence as the 3 Manson women described their loved ones' final moments in clinical detail. To kill someone, the women explained, was an act of love. It freed that person from the confines of their physical being. Almost unblinkingly, Susan Atkins recalled how Tex Watson had told her to murder Sharon Tate. He looked at her and said, "Kill her." And I killed her. I just stabbed her and she fell and I stabbed her again. I don't know how many times I stabbed her. When Susan was subsequently asked if she felt any animosity towards Sharon or the others, she shrugged. I didn't know any of them. How could I have felt any emotion without knowing them? In Susan's mind, she quote-unquote knew what she was doing was right because it felt good. Patricia Krenwinkel said she'd felt nothing when she stabbed Abigail Folger 28 times. Why? Why would she kill a woman she didn't even know? In Patricia's words, well, it's hard to explain. It was just a thought, and the thought came to be. In terms of Leslie Van Houten's remorse, or lack thereof, she told the courtroom the following. Sorry is only a 5-letter word. It can't bring back anything. What can I feel? It's happened. She's gone. She, of course, is Rosemary LaBianca, who Leslie Van Houten helped stab 41 times. As unrepentant as the women were, Prosecutor Bugliosi had his work cut out for him when it came to securing the death penalty. Bugliosi's reasoning relied on a seeming contradiction. He'd argued during the first phase of the trial that the women were quote-unquote brainwashed zombies, that they were totally in Manson's thrall. Now he had to prove the opposite, that they were as complicit as Manson was. The defense argued that the women were merely pawns. Charles Manson had used an almost technologically precise combination of drugs, hypnotism, and coercion to transform these formerly non-violent people into frenzied, psychopathic killers. Manson, the defense argued, had used the drug to ply his impressionable followers, accessing their innermost chambers of their minds and molding them to his designs. Former members of the Manson family have often recounted Manson's systematic brainwashing methods, beginning with the seduction of new recruits. He'd seduct them by quote-unquote bombarding them with love, sex, and drugs. Former Manson family member Paul Watkins, the near-weekly orgies that Manson orchestrated at the Spahn Ranch. Manson would hand out drugs, personally deciding everyone's dosages, and then, as Bugliosi writes in Helter, Skelter, Charlie might dance around, everyone else following like a train. As he'd take off his clothes, all the rest would take off their clothes. Charlie would direct the orgy, arranging bodies, combinations, positions. Watkins said he'd set it all up in a beautiful way, like he was creating a masterpiece in sculpture. But instead of clay, he was using warm bodies. Again, that was from Helter Skelter. If any of those bodies had hang-ups or inhibitions, Manson would remove them. He'd force someone else to do whatever he or she was resisting. In Bugliosi's words, a 13-year-old girl's initiation into the Manson family consisted of her being sodomized by Manson while the others watched. Manson also went down on a young boy to show the others he had rid himself of all inhibitions. Having made them feel freed and wanted, Manson would isolate his followers from the world beyond the ranch, giving them daily tasks to support the commune and forbidding them from communicating with their families or friends. Manson's followers had no newspapers, clocks, or calendars. Manson would even choose new names for his followers. Susan Atkins testified the following during the trial. In order for me to be completely free in my mind, I had to be able to completely forget the past. The easiest way to do this is to change identity. Now, the induction of new members into the Manson family was complete after they participated in lengthy LSD sessions, often stretching over consecutive days with no breaks, during which Manson only pretended to take the drug, or took a much smaller dose.
Clear-headed, Charles manipulated their minds with elaborate word games and sensory techniques. With only negligible downtime between acid trips, detachment was all the easier. Every LSD experience led the family to drift further from reality until eventually even basic contradictions seemed tenable. Death was the same as life, and good was no different from bad. Manson wanted to use LSD, in Paul Watkins' opinion, to quote-unquote instill his philosophies, exploit weaknesses and fears, and extract promises and agreements from his followers. It worked. Watkins recalled an instance in which Manson told Susan Atkins, "I'd like half a coconut, even if you have to go to Brazil to get it." According to Paul Watkins, Susan Atkins got right up and was on her way out the door when Charlie said, "Never mind." According to Paul, Manson excelled at locating deep-seated hang-ups. He took up residence in people's heads, leaving them with no point of reference, nothing to relate back to, no right, no wrong, no roots. They lived in a new reality summoned by LSD. Now, ironically, as his followers became more and more robotic, Manson taught them that people in the straight world were like computers. The worldview of people from the straight world was simply a matter of society's programming, and any program could be expunged. On the witness stand during the trial, Susan Atkins described Sharon Tate as a quote-unquote IBM machine. Words came out of her mouth, but they didn't make any sense to me. According to Tex Watson, one of the goals within the Manson family was to burn yourself out, to take so much LSD and listen to so much of Charlie's music that you return to a quote-unquote purity, a nothingness, resembling a new birth. This was called going quote-unquote dead in the head. It allowed you to incorporate yourself into the collective, sharing one common brain. Now, prosecutor Bugliosi argued that the Manson women had been psychologically compromised, but he didn't assert that Manson had actually created his killers. Despite Manson's talk about reprogramming, there was no known template for one person ever having quote-unquote reprogrammed another. Instead, Bugliosi purported that Manson's followers must have had some pre-existing homicidal impulse buried in their subconsciousness. According to this argument, Manson had learned to recognize and exploit that impulse, but even so, each woman was responsible for her actions. This argument fascinated and perplexed me. It posited a form of brainwashing in which the brainwashed were still, to some degree, themselves. When it came time to decide on the death penalty, however, the defense called a series of psychiatric experts who disagreed. Manson had brainwashed his followers, they said, and those followers couldn't be culpable for murder. LSD had given him a portal to their subconscious. The scientists explained how acid could break down and reconstruct someone's personality, how a sober quote-unquote guide intended to lead someone peacefully through hours of an acid trip could abuse the role, inserting violent ideals and beliefs into their minds. With repetition and reinforcement, these beliefs took root even when the followers were sober. Throw in other coercive techniques like sensory deprivation and hypnosis, both of which Manson embraced, and it was possible to rewrite someone's moral code such that she acknowledged no such thing as right or wrong. Dr. Joel Fort, a research psychiatrist who'd opened the nation's first LSD treatment center, was one of the defense witnesses. He believed that Manson had used LSD to produce a quote-unquote new pattern of behavior for the girls, resulting in a totally neutral system which saw death or killing in a completely different way than a normal person would, free of moral concern, compassion, or moral values. In one of the most remarkable exchanges in the trial, Manson's attorney, Irving Kinerick, asked Dr. Fort if a school for crime could exist, attended by social rejects and fueled by LSD. In Irving's exact words to Dr. Fort, "Let us say, with your knowledge of LSD, you have a school for crime, and then you take them here, and you program them to go out and commit a murder there, here, everywhere. Are you telling us that this can be done? That you can capture the human mind by such a school for crime?" In response, Dr. Fort said, "I am indeed telling you that." Dr. Fort had never seen anything like it. He compared it to a government's ability, through the nebulous power of patriotism, to condition soldiers to kill on its behalf. What no one brought up was how was it possible that someone like Manson, with little formal education and so much prison time, had mastered the ability to control people this way? Whether you thought it was full-on brainwashing or merely intense coercion, the fact remained, he'd done it. No one else had. This remains the most enduring mystery of the case.
It's the one that still keeps me up at night. And while all this back and forth about LSD is provocative, it feels like an insufficient explanation. In Helter, Skelter, author Bugliosi deals with this unfathomable riddle. How did Charles Manson, a barely literate ex-con, who'd spent more than half his life in federal institutions, end up turning a group of previously peaceful hippies, among them a small-town librarian, a high school football star, and a homecoming princess, into savage, unrepentant killers in less than a year? Bugliosi conceded that he still didn't have the answer. He writes the following. All these factors contributed to Manson's control over others, but when you add them up all together, do they equal murder without remorse? Maybe, but I tend to think there's something more, a missing link that enabled him to rape the minds of his killers that they would go against the most ingrained of all commandments, thou shalt not kill, and willingly, even eagerly, murder at Manson's command. It may be something in his charismatic, enigmatic personality, some intangible quality that no one else has yet been able to isolate and identify. It may be something he learned from others. Whatever it is, I believe Manson has full knowledge of the formula he used, and it worries me that we do not. Again, that was from Helter Skelter. Now, in the end, Manson and his family got the death penalty anyway. Bugliosi said that they had coursing through their veins the willingness to kill others. For the jury, as for the public, that was a much more comfortable truth. These people, the Manson killers, were an aberration. Brainwashing, complete loss of agency, these were difficult to contemplate, let alone to accept. When you take LSD enough times, you reach a stage of nothing, Manson had said in court. You reach a stage of no thought. No one wanted to dwell on that. Ingrained evil teased out of young women by a mastermind, that was something. And something was better than a stage of nothing. It was more comfortable to believe the killers were just an aberration. When the jury delivered the death sentences to the 4 defendants, Manson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Van Houten, the 3 women sprang to their feet. Their heads were freshly shaved, as Manson's was. They had enlarged the X's on their foreheads, as Manson had, and they were livid. "You have judged yourselves," Patricia Krenwinkel screamed at the jury. "Better lock your doors and watch your own kids," Susan Atkins warned. "Your whole system is a game," Leslie Van Houten shouted. "You blind, stupid people, your children will turn against you." Out on the street, Sandy Good, one of Manson's fiercest loyalists, looked into a TV camera and said, "Death? That's what you're all going to get." With all that, the Manson family was swept off the national stage. End quote. 7 people had been brutally murdered, but the nation was confident that we knew how and why, and that the evil people were behind bars. End quote. As mentioned, I am working on a longer video about Charles Manson, LSD, and the CIA. Keep an eye out for that one. Now, before wrapping up this video, I do want to touch on one more subject. In terms of hallucinations, in terms of seeing things, there was a famous instance with Sharon Tate in which she recalled seeing dead people. I have touched on this in a previous video, but for those of you who haven't heard it, essentially, Sharon Tate, 3 years before her death, had a disturbing vision. According to CieloDrive.com, on September 2nd, 1969, columnist Dick Kleiner wrote a very interesting piece about how apparently Sharon Tate told him in 1966, 3 years before her death, that she saw a vision of her body mutilated. Quote, "It was just a creepy story when Sharon Tate told it to me in early 1966. But now, 3 years and several murders later, it has acquired something much more than just creepiness. Sharon was a starlet in 1966. People thought she was going to be a big star, and maybe she would have been. She was sensational to look at, but there was something a little strange about her. Everybody noticed it. People thought at the time perhaps it was because her first feature film was an oddball terror thing called Eye of the Devil. But in any case, you could look at her for hours and listen to the nutty stories coming out of that beautiful head. I like stories of the supernatural, and Sharon knew that. She had a story like that to share with me. The story involved Jay Sebring and his house in Benedict Canyon. No, not the house where Sharon and Jay were killed in 1969. That house was on Cielo Drive, just off Benedict. But those 2 houses can't be much more than a mile apart. Anyways, Sharon used to date Jay Sebring. This was before she met Roman Polanski. Sharon and Jay were together for years, and Jay had a house in Benedict Canyon. This house was once owned by Paul Byrne, a director, writer, and producer for MGM.
On September 5, 1932, Paul Byrne commits suicide in this house. Sharon calmly told me this story. Now, at some point in Sharon's relationship with Jay Sebring, it seems that Jay was in New York on business, and Sharon was in between apartments. She called Jay and asked if she could stay in his house. Of course she could. That night at the house, that dark night, she was alone. Sharon wasn't usually spooked, but for some reason that night in the house, she was. She kept a light on by the side of her bed. Sharon told me, "I saw a creepy little man. He looked like the pictures I'd seen of Paul Byrne." Sharon ran downstairs. When she got downstairs, she wished she was still upstairs. "I saw a vision of someone tied to the staircase," she said. "It might have been me. It might have been Jay, but whoever it was, this body was cut open at the throat." Sharon needed a drink to calm her nerves. She eventually found the house bar, and there was some wallpaper by that bar. For some reason, Sharon picked away at the wallpaper and tore it down. Strange how the mind works. Worrying about wallpaper when ghosts are wandering around upstairs and mutilated bodies are tied to the staircase downstairs. Sharon thought it must have been a dream. She decided to find out and went back upstairs. According to Sharon, the mutilated body was still tied to the stairs. Could it have been her body or Jay's body? And that creepy little man was still prowling around upstairs. But Sharon went back to bed and somehow slept. When Jay Sebring came back the next morning, he woke her up. She remembered the events of the night before, but it must have been a dream. However, according to Sharon, Jay called out, "Hey, who tore the wallpaper off by the bar down here?" That part, at least, was not a dream. 3 years later, a mile up the road, there was a nightmare. Sharon, Jay, and 3 others, 4 if you include Sharon's unborn child, were all killed.
End quote. Now, this is the part where I dive deep into the history of Helter Skelter.
Helter Skelter was their song they wrote. You know, I didn't have no particular meaning to me. "I want to hold your hand," you know, yeah, well, they still want to hold my hand, you know. They're just kids as far as I'm concerned. McCartney, or whatever his name is, don't know what he's doing. He's up there making music with people that's creating babies all across the country that he's the father of all kinds of things that he doesn't even have the brains to realize. You know, you don't lay with that snake, or that snake is going to eat you sooner or later.
Later in this video, I'm going to share with you the reaction of Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison to Charles Manson and the murders which many refer to as the Helter Skelter killings. Helter Skelter is a song written by Paul McCartney which was released in 1968 on the Beatles' White Album. Manson believed there were multiple songs on that album which were sending him violent messages. Helter Skelter, Revolution 9, Piggies, Blackbird, etc. He believed that the album was talking to him.
Oh, come on, man. Music gives everyone messages. That's what music does. I mean, how do I have to appear like I'm some kind of maniac because I can hear something that the music says? You know, when the music said somewhere over the rainbow, you know, in other words, I'm still there over the rainbow.
That was from an interview Manson did in 1994 with journalist Bill Scanlon Murphy. I'll be showing you more of that interview in a few minutes. But first, I want to go over some more details about Manson's obsession with the song Helter Skelter and the White Album in general. Revolution 9, for instance, is another song from the White Album. Manson believed the title of the song, Revolution 9, was actually a reference to Revelation 9 from the Bible. In the Bible, in Revelation 9, it says the following, "And he opened the bottomless pit, and there came out the locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power." Locusts, of course, are a type of insect, and beetles are also insects. Therefore, Manson thought the Beatles symbolized the insects from Revelation 9, who emerged from a bottomless pit with divine power. It gets even crazier. The bottomless pit is the most important part here. Manson believed there was going to be an apocalyptic race war between white and black people, and that ultimately the black population would win. Therefore, in order to survive this war, Manson told his followers they would need to live inside of a bottomless pit somewhere in the Death Valley, California desert, and they would live in this bottomless pit until they multiplied into 144,000 people. I'll explain why Manson decided upon 144,000 in particular a bit later. Bottom line, the name Manson came up with for this crazy apocalyptic race war was Helter Skelter. Why Helter Skelter? Because to Manson, Helter Skelter meant chaos, destruction, confusion, all the negative things that would happen during the war.
Woo! That's what I call confusion. That's Helter Skelter, It just means confusion. That's an English word. It's, I bet. And then when the Beatles come up with it, that was their song. Fear has a big thing to do with music. Who holds the fear holds the sound. Who holds like the mules get on one side of the mountain and go, oh, and the mules get on the other side and go, oh, and the loudest mule, all the jennies go to the mule that sings the best. It's the same thing with the music.
Who controls the music controls the audience. Who controls the message controls the behavior, controls the narrative. I think that's what Manson was essentially saying there. In terms of controlling the narrative, there has been a lot of criticism over the past several years regarding the book Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter was written by Vincent Bugliosi, the district attorney for the Manson trial. A district attorney, or DA for short, is a type of prosecutor, a public official who represents the government in criminal cases. For decades, since its release in 1974, the Helter Skelter book was widely considered the definitive account of the Manson murders and the Manson trial. However, in 2019, with the release of Tom O'Neill's investigative book, Chaos, many of the things stated in Helter Skelter have been proven to be false. For instance, during the Manson murder trial in the early 70s, multiple former members of the Manson family testified that Charles Manson would talk obsessively about an upcoming apocalyptic race war, which prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi framed as the quote-unquote Helter Skelter motive. For his part, however, Manson has publicly denied the Helter Skelter motive repeatedly over the years. And so, did Manson believe in Helter Skelter or not? Various experts on Manson think that he did likely believe some type of an apocalyptic race conflict was coming, but that Vincent Bugliosi's mainstream Helter Skelter theory is sensationalized and exaggerated.
You see what I'm saying? In other words, he's got a lot more going than Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter is just one little foot he's playing. Now, he comes back to me from Geneva, wants to be my sunshine, if I'll agree with him on his Helter Skelter theory.
The central thesis of the Helter Skelter book is that Manson orchestrated the Tate LaBianca murders in order to start the apocalyptic race war between white and black people. The Manson family wanted to frame black nationalists as having committed the murders, thereby angering the white population into taking revenge. While this is true to an extent, the book Chaos proved that there was a lot more behind the murders than the Helter Skelter race war theory, or just Manson wanting revenge for Terry Melcher rejecting him. Terry Melcher being the record producer who used to live at the Sharon Tate residence. Some people believe that Sharon Tate and her friends weren't even an intended target, but that rather Manson mistakenly thought Terry Melcher still lived at that house and that he sent his followers to kill Melcher. I'll be touching on that debate as well a bit later.
Terry Melcher come up to the ranch and made some promises to a lot of people he didn't keep.
Terry Melcher came to me. I didn't come to Terry Melcher. He come to me with money in his hand. He offered me. I didn't ask him. I wasn't knocking someone's door down. I was running from that. When I got out, I was in that. I was already through that. I had that. I had the studio. I went to the studio. So it's about it. Oh, how you are. How do you your heart? Yeah, that's what I sing. I sing, just however I feel.
Now, the initial reason the term Helter Skelter became associated with Charles Manson is this image here. The Tate LaBianca murders took place on August 8th and 9th of 1969. During the night of August 9th, the Manson family attacked the LaBianca residence. Patricia Krenwinkel, one of the Manson killers, took the blood of Lino LaBianca, one of the two victims, and used his blood to write the words Helter Skelter on the fridge door. Ironically, she spelled Helter Skelter incorrectly. There's no A in Helter, but that's aside the point. Some of the other words written at the murder scene were Rise and Death to Pigs. The night before, at the Sharon Tate residence, the word pig was also written in blood. Pig and Death to Pigs are both references to another song from the Beatles' White Album, a song titled Piggies. Manson interpreted this song as encouraging hostility towards wealthy or establishment figures, aka pigs. George Harrison is the one who wrote the lyrics to Piggies, and he was absolutely horrified when he heard about the murders. George Harrison would make it clear that the song Piggies was meant as a satirical song about greed and arrogance from the wealthy, but it was not a call to violence. Clutching forks and knives to eat the bacon is a lyric from Piggies. The bacon, in this case, symbolically being the LaBiancas, who were viciously stabbed to death with knives. Reflecting further on the Manson murders, George Harrison said the following during an interview conducted at some point between 94 and 95 for the Beatles anthology series. Quote, "Everybody was getting on the big Beatle bandwagon. The police, the promoters, and the murderers too. The Beatles were topical, and they were the main thing that was written about in the world, so everybody attached themselves to us, whether it was our fault or not. It was upsetting to be associated with something as sleazy as Charles Manson. Another thing I found offensive was that Manson suddenly portrayed the long hair kind of image, as well as being a murderer. Up until that point, having long hair and a beard was just a case of being scruffy or something. It had nothing to do with being a murderer." End quote. What George Harrison just said fits in perfectly with the hypothesis that Charles Manson may have been a CIA asset. For instance, there is a theory that the CIA was trying to destroy the popularity of the hippie movement because hippies were anti-government. On the surface, Manson and his followers looked like your typical everyday hippies with long hair, doing drugs, free love, and communal living. Therefore, after the Manson murders, when the media kept associating Charles Manson with hippies, it heavily tainted the hippie image, the hippie movement. The peace and love image of the hippies was damaged via Charles Manson. On a similar note, Ringo Starr said the following about how the Manson murders really dented the peace and love atmosphere of the 60s. Quote, "It was pretty miserable, actually, and everyone got really insecure. Not just us, not just the rockers, but everyone in Los Angeles felt like it can happen to anyone. It was upsetting. I mean, I knew Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. It was a rough time. It stopped everyone in their tracks because suddenly all this violence came out in the midst of all this love and peace." End quote. It's not clear exactly where that Ringo quote originated from. But in any case, what Ringo said about Manson essentially damaging the hippie vibe also fits in perfectly with the Charles Manson CIA theory. Again, it's just a theory. It's never been definitively proven that the CIA had any involvement with Manson or the murders. However, it has been proven that there were people in Manson's circle who had CIA connections, specifically with MKUltra, the CIA's infamous mind control program. More on that shortly. For now, I want to share with you a clip of John Lennon discussing the Manson murders.
What's Helter Skelter got to do with knifing somebody? You know, I've never listened to the words properly, Helter Skelter. It was just a noise, you know. I don't know what I thought when it happened. I just think a lot of the things he says are true. That he's a child of the state, and he took their children in when nobody else would, is what he did. But of course he's cracked, all right. He's like any other Beatle kind of fan who reads mysticism into it. I mean, we used to have a laugh putting this, that, and the other in a light-hearted way that some intellectual would read as some symbolic youth generation what's it. But we also took seriously some part of the role, you know. But, I mean, I don't know, what's Helter Skelter got to do with knifing somebody?
It's not clear exactly where the original recording of that John Lennon quote is from, though it was likely done at some point in the 70s. In any case, a Helter Skelter is an amusement ride that looks like a lighthouse. That's literally what it is. A Helter Skelter is just a slide. In Paul McCartney's book, Many Years From Now, released in 1998, he said the following about Helter Skelter. Quote, "I was using the symbol of a Helter Skelter as a ride from the top to the bottom, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. This was the demise, the going down. You could have thought of it as a rather cute title, but it's since taken on all sorts of ominous overtones because Manson picked it up as an anthem." End quote. In 2018, Paul McCartney told the magazine NME that Charles Manson's association with Helter Skelter stopped him from playing the song live. Quote, "That put me off from doing it for forever. I thought, I'm not going to play Helter Skelter because it was too close to that event, the Tate LaBianca murders. If I played Helter Skelter, it would have seemed like I didn't care about the carnage or whatever. So I kept away from it for a long time." End quote. The first time Paul McCartney ever played Helter Skelter live was in 1976 with the band The Wings, about 7 years after the Tate LaBianca killings. The Beatles never played Helter Skelter live. The Beatles, of course, famously stopped playing live shows in 1966. Helter Skelter was released in 1968. The Beatles only played one ever live show again after 1966. Their famous performance on top of the Apple Building in London on January 30th of 1969. That would have been the band's only ever opportunity to play Helter Skelter live, which of course they didn't. By the way, quick side note, when I say the Beatles performed on the Apple Building, I'm not talking about Steve Jobs' Apple, which wasn't even formed until 1976. I'm talking about Apple Corps Limited, which is a multimedia company founded by the Beatles themselves in 1963. I'll do a separate video on that another time. Going back to the White Album, as discussed, there were multiple songs on that record which Manson thought were sending him secret messages. One of those songs was Blackbird. The song played a key role in Manson's belief of an upcoming race war. He interpreted the song Blackbird as essentially a warning that black people were going to rise up against white society. You were only waiting for this moment to arise. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. Those are lyrics from Blackbird, which Manson interpreted as a signal, a warning about an imminent black uprising. Interestingly, Paul McCartney once explained that Blackbird was in fact a song about race, but the song was not a warning of an upcoming race war. The song was not in any way a call to violence. Rather, Paul McCartney once explained that the song was about civil rights in the U.S. and the resilience of black women during segregation. Manson, however, twisted the positive symbolism of the song and portrayed it as something dark and violent. In any case, as mentioned earlier, Manson planned for his family to survive this race war by hiding inside of a bottomless pit somewhere in the Death Valley, California desert. This story gets crazier the more you look into it. Apparently, Manson believed that in this bottomless pit, he would find a paradise with food, water, and endless treasure. Then, within the safety of this pit, Manson and his followers would all have children together until their population reached 144,000 people. Why specifically 144,000? Because Manson apparently got his inspiration from the 12 tribes of Israel. Each of the tribes had 12,000 people, an overall total of 144K. Therefore, once Manson's family reached 144,000, they would emerge from the bottomless pit and rule over the surviving black people from the war. The fact Manson got some of these ideas from Beatles lyrics is nuts.
What does it mean, rock and roll? What is this rock and roll? Where does this rock and roll come from? Music comes from your king. Music comes from your soul. Hollywood plays music to little girls. I don't play little girl music. I play music for myself. See, getting down with music is not the same thing as playing music out front for the people. Getting down with music is going in the mountains and throwing up a fire and getting the drums and getting down. That's really getting funky, man.
Music played a major role in Manson's life. As a matter of fact, the Manson family had their own band. Sorta. Manson and several of his family members referred to themselves as the Family Jams.
It was called the Family Jams. It was a band, the Family Jams. We played at the chorale. We played old country-like music, old-fashioned Lefty Frizzell music, Hank Williams music, old.
In 1997, a Family Jams album was released. Yes, actually. The album consists of various songs members of the Manson family recorded throughout 1970. The same year the Manson murder trial began. Charles Manson does not appear on this album, though all of the songs on the record were written by Charles. The album is simply titled The Family Jams. It was released by two independent record labels, Transparency Records and Aurora Records. This album is not very well known. The most well-known album associated with Manson is Lie, The Love and Terror Cult. The entire album features Manson performing original songs. The recordings took place at various points throughout 1967 to 68. The album was released on March 6 of 1970, 3 months before the Manson murder trial began, on June 15th of 1970. Now, very controversially, there is a song on this album which the Beach Boys essentially stole. Here's the backstory. Charles Manson was very close friends with Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. One of the songs that Manson wrote and recorded over the years is called Cease to Exist, a song which Dennis really liked. Before Cease to Exist could be released, the Beach Boys basically re-recorded the song without Manson's permission. Dennis Wilson changed the lyrics and some of the musical structure of the track, and overall, the name of the song was changed as well. Instead of Cease to Exist, the Beach Boys version of the song is titled Never Learn Not to Love. The Beach Boys included Never Learn Not to Love on their album 2020, which was released on February 10th of '69. Manson didn't get any songwriting credits. Instead, Dennis Wilson was listed as the only songwriter. Charles Manson was furious.
Then when I come up with a song and they change the words, I say, don't change the words. If you change the words, my shadows are running fast, man. I'm running out of the monk's hood. I'm running out of Boys Town, Father Flanagan's, Nebraska. I'm running out of Irish Catholic Church, man. I'm running out of, you see what I'm saying? In other words, I'm running from IRA. I'm running out of everyone that wants to live on the planet Earth, man. I'm running from nowhere and doing nothing. I'm all the same. It's just such as it goes on, and Shakespeare was a clown. He changed the words like that. He changed it for his little girls, for his money. He compromised himself for money. Crime, you don't compromise yourself for money. You got a poker game. If you can't win, you take your pistol and take the money. You play, and then when you see that you can't win, you just take it. You pull your claymore out, man, and you do what any black pirate does, man. You take everything on the board and you go from another direction, you know.
Interestingly, Manson was basically saying in that clip that he would have preferred it if Dennis Wilson just stole the song straight up, as opposed to changing the lyrics, some of the musical structure, etc. Their relationship, Manson and Dennis Wilson, was crazy. I'm going to go much more into detail about their relationship in a bit, but essentially, the two of them became friends in 1968 after Dennis Wilson picked up two hitchhikers in Los Angeles who happened to be girls from Manson's cult. Several of Manson's girls ended up living at Dennis Wilson's house that summer, and Manson himself was a frequent visitor.
Jimi Hendrix lived, 3 doors from Dennis, and Elvis lived 2 blocks, you know, so that's just like going looking in somebody else's icebox. But you see, here's the thing, man, like me in particular, I'm not, I'm not impressed very easily by very much, you know. I'm impressed by my counselor and associate warden to see if I can get to a guitar.
Even during his years in jail, Manson still tried to focus on music. As a matter of fact, on April 7th of 2005, Charles Manson released a new album. The album is titled One Mind. It features songs, poems, and speeches by Manson, accompanied with acoustic guitar. The entire album was recorded by Charles Manson on a portable tape recorder in his jail cell at San Quentin Prison. San Quentin is located near San Francisco, California. So how exactly did Manson release this album, given the fact he was in jail? Well, essentially, the album was given a very limited CD release by an independent label titled Family Jams. This label was run by Manson's supporters outside of prison. There's not much info aside from that about the label. The people behind it have deliberately kept a very low profile, and no corporate ownership has been definitively documented. In any case, the CD was available on the Family Jams website and on a handful of independent online music retailers. Thematically, the album focuses a lot on Manson's personal philosophies, which were heavily influenced by his years in jail. Regarding San Quentin in particular, it's not clear exactly when Manson recorded the album in his jail cell. Manson was locked up at San Quentin from 1971 until 74, and then again from 85 until his death in 2017.
People getting killed around me is no new thing. You come to prison, man, there's people getting killed in prison all the time. You go to San Quentin, these men, every time they walk the yard, they gotta wear, he's gotta wear shields, man. In other words, you got all kinds of violence and fear that runs in these places. When you live a life like that, it becomes a natural thing, you know. If I could get to somewhere where I could write, or I could have a tape recorder, then I could explain a lot of this. It's very difficult to explain 10 or 15 years in 2 or 3 minutes. The reality of words only say so much. The reality of motion that moves in prison moves on life and death.
on what they call a line, a main line. That reality comes from handball courts and weightlifting piles, and it comes from someone dropping a weight on somebody else's head, of somebody owing something, of a blood family debt, that the way it burns back and forward.
Extreme violence and music were two of the most prominent things in Manson's life. The same can be said for Bobby Beausoleil. He was not an official member of the Manson family, but he was in very close proximity to them. The Tate LaBianca murders took place on August 8th and 9th of '69. About 2 weeks earlier, on July 27th, there was another Manson-related murder. Bobby Beausoleil murdered Gary Hinman, a 34-year-old music teacher in Los Angeles. I'll be going into detail as to exactly why he killed him a bit later, but essentially, the Manson family wanted money from Hinman. Hinman was held hostage at his house by the Manson family for a few days, until Manson himself slashed Gary across the face. Bobby Beausoleil subsequently stabbed Gary to death. Bobby then wrote the words "political piggy" on the wall with Hinman's blood, along with a panther paw. He did this in an attempt to frame the Black Panthers for the murder. Bobby subsequently stole Gary's car after killing him and tried to escape. Where was he escaping to? There was no real plan. He just started driving away from Los Angeles. On July 29th, he was stopped by police about 3 hours north of Los Angeles, where he was subsequently arrested. Bobby's arrest was one of the dominoes leading up to the Manson murders, and even influenced the killings themselves. For instance, one of the reasons the Manson family left blood writings at the Tate LaBianca houses was to mimic what Bobby did with Gary Hinman. This was the logic. The Manson family wanted to make it seem as though the same people who killed Gary Hinman also killed the Tate LaBiancas. Why? Because if people believed that the same killers were involved in all 3 nights, then it couldn't have been Bobby. Therefore, the police would let Bobby go because they realized he's innocent. That was literally the insane logic the Manson family was operating with. Unsurprisingly, the plan did not work. The police were not fooled into thinking Bobby was innocent, and on the contrary, he's still in prison to this day as of this posting.